Is there anyone coming in? Just make sure.
The Subcommittee on Energy, Climate, and Grid Security now come to order. Chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Thank you guys for being here. Good morning and welcome to the Energy, Climate, and Grid Security Subcommittee hearing titled American Nuclear Energy Expansion, Spent Fuel Policy, and Innovation. This Congress, the Energy and Commerce Committee, has taken a bipartisan approach to the advance and expanding nuclear energy here in the United States. I'm pleased we are holding this hearing to examine a critical piece of our nuclear energy industry here in the United States, and that's spent fuel. It's important for the subcommittee to examine the state of our spent fuel policy, given its role over nuclear regulatory policy and energy policy more broadly. Over 40 years ago, Congress formally established a comprehensive nuclear waste management strategy. In 1982, Congress passed the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, which created a federal government responsibility to dispose of all high-level radioactive waste and started a process for selecting sites. In 1987, after the Department of Energy conducted extensive studies of 9 potential repository sites, Congress amended the Nuclear Policy Act to focus on Yucca Mountain in Nye County, Nevada, as a site for permanent geologic repository. Unfortunately, the political objections of one state, not based on scientific reality, blocked the repository from being licensed and constructed following its formal selection in 2002. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission staff found that Yucca Mountain Permanent Repository could safely store waste for over 1 million years. The Energy and Commerce Committee has remained committed to upholding the law, and in 2018, the House passed the Nuclear Waste Policy Amendments Act by an overwhelming bipartisan vote of 340 to 72. If this bill had become law, it would have incentivized the completion of the licensing of Yucca Mountain, enhanced host state benefits, and accelerated consolidated interim storage, a benefit to both ratepayers and taxpayers. Unfortunately, politics obstructed this bill, and we remain in the current standstill. Ratepayers across the country have paid nearly $50 billion into the Nuclear Waste Fund to establish a permanent repository. Now, these ratepayers, folks who benefited from nuclear energy, paid fees, which were baked into the utility bill for the construction of a permanent repository. With interest, ratepayers in my home state of South Carolina have contributed over $3 billion to the Nuclear Waste Fund. This is the third most of any state in the nation. Additionally, as a result of the government's failure to follow the law, American taxpayers are on the hook for up to $800 million annually out of the judgment fund. This breaks down to about $2 million per day. In addition to commercial waste, many DOE sites across the country like Savannah Riverside or Hanford store legacy or defense waste intended for permanent repository. Now I'd like to emphasize that spent nuclear fuel is stored safely on sites, but the federal government must fulfill its legal responsibility and reduce the cost burden to the taxpayer and the ratepayers. Spent nuclear fuel in the United States also provides an opportunity to be an asset as we deploy advanced nuclear technologies. The technological landscape has shifted since the 1980s, and companies like Oklo and Curio and Shine are aggressively pursuing reprocessing and recycling technologies for spent fuel. Spent fuel recycling, especially to support advanced fuels, provides exciting promise for the future of nuclear energy in the United States, especially for the advanced reactors that we hear about. Our policy should reflect innovations and advancements as part of an integrated fuel system that includes a permanent repository. It may seem we're at a standstill, but we should look at this as a moment of opportunity for the United States of America. The U.S. has always led the world in nuclear energy advancements. The Manhattan Project harnessed the energy of the nucleus atom, and the Atomic Energy Act of 1954 ushered in the age of the peaceful use of the atom, demonstrating American leadership around the world and the amazing benefits of nuclear power. We're on the precipice of the next frontier of nuclear energy here in the United States. Recently, the House overwhelmingly passed the Atomic Energy Advancement Act that Ranking Member DeGette and I put together to advance durable bipartisan policy that will expand nuclear energy. Responsible and effective spent fuel management is a critical part of the equation. It can help foster nuclear expansion here in the United States. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today on the opportunities and challenges associated with spent nuclear fuel management in the context of nuclear energy expansion. I'll take my last 10 seconds. I've been to Yucca Mountain. I've stood on top of that mountain. I thought, if we can't put the nuclear waste of the nation here, we're not going to be able to put it anywhere. The repository was chosen for a reason. I've also been to Hanford. I've been to Savannah River site, understand the EM process going on there, the high-level legacy waste that's coming out of the tank farms, been vitrified or being vitrified and needs to be stored somewhere. That's waste that I don't think can be reprocessed as spent fuel. So we have legacy waste that needs to be stored. We have spent fuel that's an asset for the nation that can be reprocessed and used as a fuel. So I look forward to today's hearing from all of our witnesses. I'll now recognize the ranking member, DeGette, for 5 minutes to give her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having this hearing and for all the reasons you stated. It's a really important hearing for this committee to have as we continue to look towards nuclear energy to provide us with a carbon-free source, because we have to find storage that does not abandon the communities that host nuclear reactors. Nuclear fuel that has already been used in a reactor has been stored on site where it was once used to generate power, even if the reactor was decommissioned and is no longer operating. Spent fuel is stored at 75 different sites in 33 different states across the country, including 23 sites that are no longer operating. The Biden administration has focused on pursuing a consent-based siting program under existing authorities. What this would do is it would allow for the siting of spent nuclear fuel under consent-based siting consortia, which engages the states earlier in the process. Nuclear spent fuel policy in the United States is governed by the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, which called for a permanent waste repository to be set up in 1998. As the chairman said, the process is obviously not easy, or it would have already been solved, as we saw with the state of Nevada and what happened with Yucca Mountain. And I, too, went to Yucca Mountain. And what I thought at the time was the same thing that the chairman thought, is this is pretty remote. But nonetheless, the testing that we needed to do there never finished. And the reason it didn't finish was because of the political winds on both sides in Washington. And I think that's a shame. But be that as it may, I think that the Biden administration is smart to seek a consent-based siting program. The price tag for storing spent fuel has been increasing for the Department of Energy, and the Government Accountability Office estimates the DOE may have up to $60 billion in liabilities for storing spent fuel by 2030. And as the cost liabilities increase, court decisions have prohibited DOE from collecting their fee of .001 per kilowatt hour of electricity generated from nuclear power. So that's equal to about $750 million annually, which was previously used to fill the nuclear waste fund, and that was designed to pay for the expenses of storing this spent fuel. So other nations, including France and India, reprocess their spent fuel. And I've actually been to the plant in France as well. That's a process in which 96% of the spent fuel can be recycled to make fresh fuel for nuclear reactors, which severely lowers the amount of spent fuel that has to be stored in a repository. But it's expensive to reprocess spent fuel. But again, the cost of doing nothing is also high if we leave the spent fuel stored on site, even if the plant was decommissioned. In 2020, President Trump withdrew his support from Yucca Mountain, and he didn't request funding for the repository in fiscal year 2021. 10 years earlier, in 2010, President Obama established the Blue Ribbon Commission on America's Nuclear Future to examine alternatives to Yucca Mountain. The report recommended that the federal government create these new consent-based siting processes for future interim and permanent storage repositories. In April 2023, the Biden administration moved forward with this approach and issued the final guidelines, and the spending bill that we passed just last month had $55 million to fund DOE's consent-based siting facilities, activities. So whatever we do, we have to figure this out if we're going to have more nuclear reactors. I look forward to this hearing. I look forward to our debate. And with that, I would like to recognize Congressman Peters to yield him my remaining minute. He knows about community engagement regarding reactors, but he wants to introduce his witness from his home state of California involved in these issues.
Gentleman is recognized.
I thank the gentlelady for yielding. It's my pleasure to introduce Dan Stetson, who serves as chairman of the San Onofre Nuclear Generating Station Community Engagement Panel. The San Onofre Nuclear Generating Station, or SONGS, is just north of my district in San Diego and presents a serious issue for my constituents and those of Southern California. Dan's worked with the panel for over 10 years and has been on the front lines of developing solutions to spent nuclear fuel issues. Before his work on SONGS, Dan served as president and CEO of the Ocean Institute for nearly 11 years, where he helped provide marine science and maritime history programs for over 100,000 students annually. He has a BA in English from the University of California, Santa Barbara, an MBA from Cal State University, Fullerton, and is a veteran of the U.S. Coast Guard. Dan and the panel do a lot of great work for my district and the surrounding region. We're proud to have him represent San Diego while discussing this important topic. Thank you again for yielding, and thanks for joining us today to the witnesses. Thank you.
Gentlelady's time's expired, and I now recognize the chair of the full committee, Chair Rogers, for 5 minutes for opening statement.
Nuclear energy technologies are essential for our national security and a cleaner and more secure energy future. It's exciting to see how the promise of innovative nuclear technologies can help support the energy demands of a growing economy for industry, for manufacturing, and for the American people. This Congress, it's been encouraging to see a renewed bipartisan focus on restoring American technological leadership in nuclear energy. Energy and Commerce has a rich history of leading on these issues. Our work this Congress has been no exception. We've advanced solutions to lay the foundation for a more robust and innovative nuclear industry with strong bipartisan House votes that underscore the wide support for these policies. This includes legislation that will support the production of the innovative advanced fuels needed for new types of nuclear reactors currently under development. Our work has also included measures to make sure Russia will not be able to undermine our supply chain by seeking to bolster our domestic fuel manufacturing. That bill, H.R. 1042, the Prohibiting Russian Uranium Imports Act, passed the House by a unanimous vote, and I'm hopeful that we will get it signed into law soon. Our agenda has also included the Atomic Energy Advancement Act, led by Chair Duncan and Ranking Member DeGette, that will provide the most consequential reforms to nuclear regulation in decades. And with the continued partnership with the Senate, many of those policies should soon be on their way to enactment. Today, we turn to examining spent nuclear fuel policy. By all accounts, the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, which governs both spent nuclear fuel and high-level nuclear waste generally, is long overdue to be implemented to address the needs of today's industry. The program has been stalled for over a decade as a direct result of actions by opponents to the Yucca Mountain project, the designated storage facility for spent nuclear fuel. These unfortunate actions have undermined the law and poisoned public trust in how we manage spent nuclear fuel for far too long, and have jeopardized efforts to manage defense obligations for things like Navy fuels and cleanup of legacy Cold War sites, like the Hanford site just outside of my district in eastern Washington. As we will hear in testimony this morning, this opposition is not safety-related or technical. It's political. Opposition from states like Nevada, in particular, to this program has inhibited congressional appropriations and driven the executive branch to dismantle what has otherwise been a technically successful program. This program, if allowed to move forward, would provide the public information that's critical to earning people's support and trust for nuclear energy. This committee took steps in 2018 to get the licensing program for Yucca Mountain back on track with a reform package that culminated in a very strong bipartisan House vote. While those efforts ultimately failed in the Senate, they proved that it is possible to build bipartisan support for a durable spent fuel program, which is what brings us here today. To secure American nuclear leadership, we must continue this committee's work to update the law and build state support for a permanent repository at Yucca Mountain. Our conversation this morning will also highlight the prospects of a growing fleet of nuclear reactors and how, by utilizing innovative technologies, we can improve the management of spent nuclear fuel in the U.S. Innovative companies like Curio and Oklo are already developing innovative technologies that will enhance the use of energy from spent fuels. We should be building on this work to ensure America's dominance for the next century. By embracing American technology and innovation, we can ensure nuclear energy benefits communities across the country and around the world. American leadership matters. Failure to lead will result in the international civilian nuclear markets being dominated by our adversaries, like China and Russia, which undermines our energy security and nuclear safety. These goals should be bipartisan, and I look forward to discussing how this committee can help ensure the U.S. wins the future and restores nuclear leadership. Thank you to our witnesses for being here today. I yield back.
Generally yields back. We'd be remiss if we didn't recognize the work that our former colleague John Shimkus did on this particular issue, and I appreciate the work. I'll now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's been now nearly 70 years since the emergence of civilian nuclear energy in the U.S., and yet we still have not found a workable solution to address the storage and disposition of spent nuclear fuel. The Nuclear Waste Policy Act set a goal of setting up a permanent repository to accept spent fuel by no later than 1998, but 26 years later, we're no closer to finding a solution to the problem. And that's unfortunate because the magnitude of the problem only continues to increase. American nuclear reactors have created nearly 90,000 metric tons of spent fuel that must be stored, and right now this fuel is being stored on site at nuclear facilities across the nation where it was once used to generate power. It's even at locations that no longer have an operating nuclear reactor, like Oyster Creek site, not far from my district in New Jersey. And the lack of progress on spent fuel is particularly difficult for these communities since they cannot complete decommissioning or start redevelopment of a former reactor site until the fuel can be relocated. And the federal government has a responsibility and an obligation to the more than 70 communities that currently are home to spent fuel throughout the nation. It's critical that we find a solution that does not abandon these communities and that does not continue to come at a steep price to American taxpayers. The Government Accountability Office projects that taxpayer liability relating to spent fuel will exceed $60 billion by 2030. And we have a duty, both to the nuclear communities and to all taxpayers, to find a solution that allows us to move this spent fuel as soon as we can. This committee has a history of bipartisan work on this issue. 2018, we worked together to find a bipartisan path forward by passing the Nuclear Waste Policy Amendments Act, led by former committee members John Shimkus, as was mentioned, and Jerry McNerney. Building on that progress, I hope we can develop new bipartisan solutions to this long, intractable issue. Now, the Biden administration has recognized the urgent need for action and has responded to the call. It has continued building towards a consent-based interim storage siting process. And just last year, the Department of Energy made $26 million worth of awards to a dozen different consortia to explore a community and consent-based approach to siting facilities to store and dispose of spent fuel. These efforts will help us find a path forward that is legally and politically durable, just what communities across this nation need. And I believe that Congress must support the Biden administration's efforts here. It's a small step forward, but it represents the most concrete progress towards a solution for spent fuel that we've made in the last 15 years. And while most of the debate recently is focused on what to do with existing spent fuel, as we move to more advanced reactors that demand advanced, higher enriched fuels, the spent fuel issue will change. While some advanced reactor designs tout innovative ways to limit the amount of spent fuel that they produce, we still must take these technologies into account as we develop solutions to responsibly store this material in the decades to come. So I look forward to hearing from our witnesses about how we can find a durable pathway forward that works for communities, ratepayers, and all Americans. And I'd like to yield the remainder of my time to Representative Matsui.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pallone, and I want to thank you, Chairman Duncan, for organizing this important hearing, and I want to thank the witnesses for being here today. This is an important matter that affects many of us in our districts that have had nuclear plants or nuclear plants have been decommissioned. Now, the federal government has a duty to manage nuclear waste. They should not be and cannot be the burden of communities to deal with it on their own. In my district, the Rancho Seco nuclear power plant shut down in 1989. But 30 years later, our utility, the Sacramento Municipal Utility District, is still storing the spent fuel. So there's really nothing they can do with the land over there and anything, any redevelopment or anything. To make matters worse, SMUD has had to sue the U.S. government every single year to recover the millions of dollars it costs to safely store this waste. This is a policy failure. And I really believe there's enough concerns on this committee, as you're going to be hearing, that we have to do something about it. If we're going to make any progress on nuclear power itself, we have to deal with some of these past issues. So I encourage all my colleagues here to work with us to find a path forward. Now, I'll be submitting a statement into the record from the Sacramento Municipal Utility District detailing the costs of storing spent fuel in our district, and this is probably like every other district. And it has brought all of us together in a very bipartisan way. So I think that we're here to work. Now, I want to thank you very much, and I want to thank the ranking member, and yield back to the ranking member.
And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time's expired. We'll now conclude the members' opening statements. The Chair would like to remind members that pursuant to the committee rules, all members' opening statements will be made part of the record. We're coming with open minds to hear from the witnesses and learn as much as we can as policymakers on this issue. I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here today and taking time to testify before the subcommittee. Each witness will have the opportunity to give an opening statement, and then we'll follow that with a round of questions from each of the members. So our witnesses today are Dr. John Wagner, Laboratory Director of Idaho National Lab, Mr. Lake Barrett, former Principal Deputy Director of the Office of Civilian Waste at the Department of Energy, Mr. Daniel Stetson, Chairman of the San Onofre Nuclear Generating Station Community Engagement Panel, and Mr. Greg White, Executive Director of the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners. So we appreciate you being here today. I now recognize Dr. Wagner for 5 minutes to give an opening statement. And let me just say, the lights in front of you, I'm giving you 5 minutes. Try to adhere to that. Lights will go from green to yellow to red. At red, it's time to wrap up, and if you can wrap up, and then add during the members' questioning, whatever, if you had anything pertinent to add there at the end. But let's try to stay on time. We've got a lot of Congress people here to ask questions, and a lot of witnesses. Dr. Wagner, 5 minutes.
First, I have to see if this is actually working. Is it working? Okay. All right, great. Thank you. Thank you. Chair Rogers, Ranking Member Pallone, Subcommittee Chair Duncan, and Ranking Member DeGatte, and members of the subcommittee. I want to thank you for the opportunity to be here with you today. My name is John Wagner. I am the Laboratory Director at the Idaho National Laboratory, the nation's Center for Nuclear Energy Research and Development. Throughout my career, I've been directly involved in technical issues related to the nuclear fuel cycle, which we're talking about today. In fact, my first position following graduate school was with a private company designing and licensing spent fuel storage and transportation systems that are deployed around the world today. So I very much have a lot of interest in this topic. Let me start, though, by noting that as we speak, our nation's nuclear reactor fleet is excelling. It generates the nation's most reliable and resilient electricity, providing 24/7 power to American homes, hospitals, schools, and businesses. Last year, 92 reactors generated nearly 20% of America's electricity and roughly half the nation's carbon-free electricity. With those points in mind, I'd like to emphasize that over the past several years, much has changed. Public opinion polls show increasingly broad support for nuclear energy, and nuclear energy now has bipartisan and bicameral support in Congress. Industry giants and major energy users such as Dow Chemical, Nucor, Amazon Web Services, Google, Meta, Microsoft, and many others are increasingly turning to nuclear to secure uninterrupted carbon-free power for their operations. We've shifted from declining nuclear capacity to an ambitious pledge, along with 20 other countries, to triple nuclear capacity by 2050. With 2 new reactors online in Georgia recently and several next-generation nuclear demonstration projects progressing through collaboration between industry and the national laboratories, new and innovative nuclear technologies are positioned to play an increasingly important role in America's energy future. Through both legislative and technical efforts, the U.S. is on the cusp of achievements that could usher in a new era of nuclear energy and reestablish U.S. global leadership. And so it's no longer a matter of whether we need advanced nuclear technologies, but rather how much nuclear power we need and how do we enable its success. Yet, despite these dramatic changes, our approach to managing the nation's spent nuclear fuel is guided by policies developed decades ago in a different time and during very different circumstances. These policies no doubt reflected the national priorities and concerns of the time, but today the questions that we must ask are whether those policies continue to reflect our priorities and if they enable or impede the development and deployment of advanced nuclear technologies that our nation needs. At the center of this discussion is the Nuclear Waste Policy Act of 1982. Various attempts, including from this committee, have been made to amend the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, but none has yet succeeded. A new waste policy framework is needed to move beyond the current nuclear waste management and disposition stalemate. This is not only an issue for the nuclear industry, but also for U.S. taxpayers. Another spent fuel policy issue is recycling. Even though it is no longer prohibited, no commercial nuclear fuel recycling occurs in the United States because the once-through fuel cycle is considered the cheaper option, and the Nuclear Waste Policy Act provides no financial incentives or mechanisms to support recycling. It's worth noting that the U.S. originally did intend to recycle. Recycling was envisioned at the time as the prudent and sustainable option. For geopolitical and security reasons, the U.S. terminated the commercial recycling program in 1976, believing that such actions would persuade other nations to follow suit. That did not happen. Instead, countries like France, Russia, and China have moved forward with their recycling programs, creating a competitive disadvantage for the United States. With this background in mind, there are several questions I believe this committee should be asking, such as, should we update our nuclear waste management policies to reflect the realities of today and the needs of tomorrow? What role should nuclear fuel recycling play in the United States? And how do we balance spent fuel management and disposition with the need to develop and deploy new nuclear reactors now? Answering these questions and addressing our nuclear waste management obligations would boost public confidence in nuclear energy and offer certainty to plant operators, utilities, energy investors, and the communities where spent fuel is currently stored. In closing, I appreciate the opportunity to be a part of this process, and I want to thank the committee for their work on nuclear energy and for their attention to this important issue. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Wagner. Mr. Barrett, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Let's see. Can you hear me? Yes, thank you. Chairman Duncan, Ranking Member Jacquette, and our committee chairman here. Thank you very much for inviting me here today. Our generation and the one before us created nuclear reactors for our national security and energy needs, and we are going to need more clean energy in the future, as has been clearly stated. We are the beneficiaries of this technology, and ethically we have a responsibility to dispose of our waste so as not to burden our children and successive generations unfairly. Historically, after a decade of intense discussion, the Nuclear Waste Policy Act of 1982 laid out a program for how DOE was to build a geologic disposal system to support our critical defense and commercial nuclear programs. Although challenging, we made initial good scientific and regulatory progress with the Yucca Mountain repository site, and we would have had an operating facility about now if we had not been stopped. However, starting in 2010, the host state of Nevada was able to politically stop all progress on Yucca Mountain by stopping funding. So the Yucca Mountain disposal option, although the law, is indefinitely politically blocked now. Sadly, we have no workable spent fuel disposal program in this country now. Reactors need to operate, so our spent fuel management plan has devolved, sadly, to installing thousands of spent fuel canisters on our lakes and seashores and rivers. Although temporarily safe, they serve no useful societal purpose other than compensating for federal inability to perform and are blocking the reuse of our shutdown reactor sites. There is always talk about doing something someday, but really right now, our plan is to give it to the grandchildren and let them figure out what to do, and wishing them good luck. This is not right, but this is what happens when we do not have a workable disposal program. We were once the international leader, but now we are the least among the major nuclear countries. And this hurts us when we try to market American products and know-how overseas. Not only is it ethically wrong, but it's also very expensive. Someone has to pay the billions of dollars to protect, build, and maintain the ever-increasing number of canister storage systems. And that is the American taxpayers who have to pay. Because DOE is not meeting its legal contractual obligations, the taxpayers are automatically paying damages through the Department of Justice Judgment Fund, which has no congressional oversight, and there is no congressional appropriations controls on those payments. These rapidly growing costs are now estimated at $51 billion, and I expect they're going to soon rise quite a bit again. These are our generation's waste, and our grandchildren are the ones who are going to have to pay for it, even though they took no part in their making nor receive any benefits for them. New advanced nuclear technologies, such as new reprocessing approaches, may be able to somewhat assist in the future in geologic disposal. I'm an optimist about some of that happening, but they are not a substitute. We still are going to need geologic disposal in an integrated plan in the future. Geologic disposal was not stopped by a technical problem. It was a social political problem that we must solve together. Importantly, not solving our nuclear waste problem is going to hinder the development of new needed future reactors, because it degrades the public trust and confidence, and it questions our environmental stewardship commitment, which we have and we need to fulfill. I firmly believe there are reasonable paths forward that can create a workable federal host-state relationship that can support integrated spent fuel management that our country desperately needs. Some specific suggestions are that we can go forward with a second repository program, which is under the Nuclear Waste Policy Act now, with congressional support. All parties should be working together to develop a new, independent, dedicated waste management organization to implement this necessary program, and that should be outside of the Department of Energy. This organization should be held accountable and empowered for performance, including creating and managing workable host-state relationships that can truly function in our United States of America system. I personally believe a federal host-state partnership arrangement in the form of a public service corporation is the most likely successful construct. It is time for the federal government to step up in a thoughtful, forward-looking, bipartisan manner. We need to take responsibility for decisions we made 8 decades ago to produce nuclear fuel, and 4 decades ago to develop a geologic repository system. On a personal note, 55 years ago, as a young engineer, I participated in the last nuclear refueling of the United States submarine, the USS Nautilus. We took the spent fuel out, we sent that to Idaho, and the waste from that, it was reprocessed in Idaho, and the waste from that fuel today sit on the Snake River, over the Snake River aquifer in temporary canisters. That was 55 years ago. I don't want to see my great-great-grandchildren having to deal with the same problem again. So we need to get together. I'm very thankful for this committee and its good work in this area, but I look forward to what you can help our country solve this problem and enable the federal government to discharge its responsibilities. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett. Mr. Stetson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Good morning, Chairman Duncan. Oops. How about that? Is that better? There we go. Okay. Technology, not my better suit. Good morning, Chairman Duncan, Ranking Member DeGette, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for your service and the opportunity to testify at today's meeting. My name is Dan Stetson, and I'm here in my role as volunteer chair of the SONGS Community Engagement Panel. I was invited as a representative of the communities around SONGS to share what I have learned from listening to the community for more than 10 years. I've also worked with Spent Fuel Solutions, an advocacy coalition that grew out of the communities around SONGS. For the people around SONGS, a top concern is the spent fuel, both its safe on-site storage and its prompt off-site relocation. Unfortunately, it's no secret that the U.S. Spent Fuel Management Program is a failure. And it should be no surprise that the trust of the affected communities has been shattered. We are deeply, deeply frustrated. This failure is costly in many ways. First, we had a good faith deal with the government. We paid in advance for the spent fuel disposal. In return, the DOE agreed to start picking it up in 1998. That has never happened. Second, this failure is very expensive. The on-site storage of spent fuel has already cost taxpayers more than $10 billion and is growing at a rate of more than $2 million per day. And all U.S. taxpayers are saddled with these costs, even if they never received 1 kilowatt of energy provided from nuclear power. Third is generational equity. It's just not fair to burden our children and future generations with this problem. Fourth, the communities around Songs never agreed to be hosting spent fuel for the long term. Additionally, Songs sits on land owned by the Navy. They want it back, and they want it back without the spent fuel to support their mission to train the Marines. Finally, if we are to leverage next-generation reactors, we must still address the back end of the fuel cycle. This is not a technical problem. We know how to dispose of the spent fuel. The problem is where, and this is obviously a political challenge. Fixing the problem means fixing the federal law. Last spring, I was joined by 24 stakeholders from across the country to discuss how to amend the Nuclear Waste Policy Act and create a program that includes both near-term interim storage and permanent disposal. We produced 6 policy principles, and these are in order of priority. Number 1, a single-purpose federal organization to assume the spent fuel program from the DOE. Number 2, reliable funding. 3, pursuit of multiple permanent deep geological repositories, or DGRs. 4, revisiting the linkage between consolidated interim storage, or monitored retrieval storage, and permanent disposal in DGRs. 5, expanding the application of Federal Title II and liability for spent fuel to include private consolidated interim storage. And number 6, transportation planning, including public information and emergency preparedness. Let me emphasize that consolidated interim storage is monumentally important to the communities around Songs because it can deliver off-site storage literally decades before DGRs. Finally, I think it's important to highlight a few points regarding consent-based siting, Yucca Mountain, and reprocessing. International best practices tell us that a consent-based approach is the most reliable process for siting spent fuel disposable facilities. This is going to require building on an enduring trust, a mutually beneficial relationship between potential host communities, tribes, and the implementing organization. This is a partnership that must be built over time, adapting to the needs of each individual candidate community as well as state acceptance. With respect to Yucca Mountain, and in the spirit of consent-based siting, federal law should not predetermine DGR sites. On reprocessing, we must remember that independent of our decisions on reprocessing, we're still going to need a place to store the spent fuel. At the Ocean Institute, where I worked for 23 years, our motto was, experience is a teacher. We needed to learn from our mistakes. In closing, I'm highly optimistic and encouraged. I'm encouraged that DOE is working on consolidated interim storage. I'm encouraged that Finland will open the world's first deep geological repository later this year. And I'm greatly encouraged that this congressional subcommittee is talking about the spent fuel problem, and I am highly optimistic that you will soon be working on solutions. Thank you.
Mr. Stetson, thank you. Mr. White, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. Stetson, did you cut your mic off? I think, there you go.
All right. Very good. Good morning, Subcommittee Chairman Duncan, Ranking Member DeGette, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before the subcommittee today on this important topic. My name is Greg White. I'm the Executive Director of the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, known as NARUC, on whose behalf I testify today. NARUC's members are the state public utility commissioners in each of the 50 states and the District of Columbia that are responsible for ensuring that utility ratepayers receive reliable, safe, and affordable energy utility services. In other words, our members are responsible for the ratepayers who have faithfully paid for every aspect of the failed federal civilian nuclear waste disposal program. The nation's ratepayers have paid tens of billions of dollars toward the federal nuclear waste program envisioned in the 1982 Nuclear Waste Policy Act with virtually nothing to show for it. In fact, there currently is no federal nuclear waste disposal program to speak of. NARUC and its member commissions have dedicated a tremendous amount of time, resources, and effort over the past 42 years to ensure that electricity consumers receive the nuclear waste management and disposal services they have paid for. We were at the table when the Nuclear Waste Policy Act was developed and passed. State regulators agreed that users of electricity generated at the nation's nuclear power plants should pay for the nuclear waste program. We still support that concept. However, please note that the only component of the federal nuclear waste disposal program that happened on time and as intended was the collection of the fee from the ratepayers for the program. And incredibly, NARUC actually had to sue the federal government to stop the continued collection of the nuclear waste disposal fee from ratepayers after the program was abruptly shut down in violation of the law and without a Plan B. We had to do our jobs. The ratepayers should not have to pay for nothing. Now the nation's taxpayers are footing the bill to the tune of some $2 million per day in damages paid out to the nuclear utilities for the federal failure. NARUC hopes that the renewed interest in advanced nuclear technologies will spark genuine commitment on the part of the federal government to finally resolve the nation's nuclear waste disposal program. Many states and state commissioners are excited at the prospect of advanced nuclear technologies that can provide reliable, emissions-free electricity generation. Historically, the excitement and therefore the focus of nuclear generating technologies has always been on its vast potential. In contrast, the focus on the back end of the nuclear fuel cycle, disposal of spent nuclear fuel, has been completely inadequate. The need for and success of a federal nuclear waste program is necessarily of keen interest and should be prioritized to properly serve the needs of the nation. To move forward with a successful U.S. nuclear waste program, NARUC believes that 1, efforts should be made to fund and oversee the completion of the licensing review for the Yucca Mountain Repository Project. 2, the Nuclear Waste Fund must be managed responsibly and used only for its intended purpose. 3, if progress is made on licensing of a permanent repository, it should be much easier then to cite consolidated interim storage. 4, Congress should consider assigning management of used fuel management to a single-purpose organization, although I will remind everyone that that was what ACRWM was intended to do. If implemented in the near term, these steps create a solid foundation on which to build a viable nuclear management program, spent fuel nuclear management program. Thank you for the opportunity to express these views. I'd be very pleased to take any questions at this time.
Mr. White and other panelists, thank you for your testimony. We'll now move into the question and answer portion of today's hearing. We'll alternate between sides, and I'll begin by questioning and recognize myself for 5 minutes. So let me start off by saying the law of the land. The Nuclear Waste Policy Act of 1982, as amended in 87, established federal legal responsibility for the ultimate disposal of spent fuel. You all indicate that the failure to carry out this responsibility has deprived ratepayers of a program and cost taxpayers millions of dollars every day, as Mr. White noted. Spent fuel recycling can work. It can work well as part of an integrated fuel system, but we always need a permanent repository, especially for legacy and defense waste like that at Savannah River Site, Idaho, Hanford, other places, because they can't be reprocessed. So I'm asking you all, reprocessing or recycling technologies offer exciting promise, but will they eliminate the need for a permanent repository? Dr. Wagner.
No, they will not.
Mr. Barrett?
No, they will not.
Mr. Stetson? No, they will not. Mr. White?
No, they will not.
Thank you for that. Mr. Barrett, it's important to note that there have been tremendous technical achievements resulting from the work to license Yucca Mountain. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes, sir.
How do we protect that progress and build upon those achievements?
We must reach some accord with the state of Nevada and go forward in a win-win manner. Our last couple decades has been either I win, you lose, and that is not served this country well. So we have got to mend the fence there. That's very difficult to do after the 87 Amendment, but I believe that can be accomplished.
Currently, spent fuel is stored and safely managed on sites across the country. What are there? 120 sites in 39 states, plus or minus. A comprehensive system would further strengthen the nuclear industry. Dr. Wagner, do you believe spent nuclear fuel and the lack of a permanent repository should be an impediment to deploying new reactors?
I believe it shouldn't be, but it is.
It is, correct. As technologies advance, our regulatory policy should adjust to reflect these advancements. I was pleased to see that you all support reprocessing as an option to explore. Dr. Wagner, how should we update our federal policies to encourage spent fuel reprocessing?
Well, so right now with the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, a once-through fuel cycle was envisioned, which meant there's no mechanism actually to provide incentives for recycling spent nuclear fuel. So that's where we need to start in terms of the Nuclear Waste Policy Act structuring and to provide that mechanism.
So we've got all this money sitting in the Nuclear Waste Fund. Actually, I think there's just an IOU in that fund now. I think the money's been spent, but the federal government has an obligation. As I mentioned in my opening statement, South Carolinians have paid about $3 billion, counting rates that they pay in their utility bills plus interest over time. So couldn't we use that money to help fund some of these reprocessing projects?
So that's probably more of a question for you all than me, but my understanding is that we cannot. For one thing, that money has to be appropriated out of the waste fund, and it has not been for such purposes.
We're paying, what, $2 million a day in just penalties and interest. I remember the challenges of MOX, so I understand that, good money thrown after bad. I'm not for interim storage. I believe we've got a permanent repository at Yucca Mountain we spent a lot of money on. We have a waste fund to actually pay for the construction and management of it. I've been there. Ingress, egress is completed. We need a vault, and we need to start storing waste there. But does reprocessing or recycling present a unique opportunity for advanced reactor fuel?
It absolutely does. There are different fuel forms that are more well-suited to recycling. Also, a lot of the advanced reactors are intending to use what we call high-assay LEU fuel. So it's a higher enriched fuel, which actually contributes positively to the economics of recycling.
Yeah, thank you for that. So I visited Savannah River site in Hanford. I see the process of taking the highly radioactive waste and vitrifying it, or for edification of the crowd and TV, that means turning it to glass. That glass is molten, it's poured in stainless steel containers. Those containers still sit at Savannah River site in Hanford, waiting for a permanent repository. We've got that in Yucca Mountain. I personally love to see Yucca Mountain as an ongoing process, because I understand that we have legacy waste. Regardless of reprocess and recycling of spent fuel, which I don't consider waste, I consider a national asset as a fuel source, we do have legacy waste, and the end result of reprocessing will have some waste that will have to be stored somewhere. Glad to see what Finland's doing. We ought to take note. This nation has come up with a solution. We've got to figure out how to get that solution to be the final outcome for the nation. I'm out of time. I'll now go to Ranking Member DeGette for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess I would just, first of all, thank you all for your really insightful and honest testimony. It's very much appreciated on both sides of the aisle here as we grapple with this difficult issue. And one of my great frustrations with Yucca Mountain was these shifting political winds, both with the Nevada issue, but also in Congress, where they were in the process of constructing the site, doing the testing. Then Congress would pass a bill that tried to truncate the testing and just send waste there. Then the next Congress, we would just try to decertify Yucca Mountain, and it just went back and forth like that. And I think it's a shame. And I think all of you will agree that there are a lot of hurdles to reopening Yucca, not the least of which is the continuing political opposition in Nevada, but also we would have to start up the whole testing process again. And so in the meantime, we're looking at all of these other efforts, and I think that we should do that, but we should keep every option on the table, because if we're going to hope to move forward, then we're going to need to do that. Chairman Duncan and I, you heard, we wrote the Atomic Energy Advancement Act. We're hoping to get that through the Senate and get it signed into law in this Congress, but we didn't talk about the spent fuel issues, so we're going to have to do that as this Congress progresses and into the next Congress. Mr. Wagner, you were talking a little bit to the chairman about the fuel from these advanced reactors. I'm wondering if there are unique challenges to storing spent fuel that's been enriched to a higher level, and what can we do to improve our policies to deal with these advanced fuels?
So I wouldn't say there are any unique challenges associated with storing and transporting these higher enriched fuels. It's a difference between about 5 weight percent U-235 and 20 weight percent, still considered low enriched uranium. That's why it has sort of this funny name, high assay LEU or HALEU. So I don't see any new challenges there. Some of the new fuel, advanced reactors do have different fuel forms for which we don't currently have systems commercially designed to store those materials. But I believe that is all very manageable as well. We would just have to design new storage and transportation cast systems to accommodate those materials.
Okay. Now, also in your testimony, you talk about that the Idaho National Lab is working on the processes that would generate HALEU. Is that how you say it?
HALEU.
HALEU, okay, from downbending high enriched uranium. So can you talk about that process to be able to develop it for advanced reactors?
Yeah, absolutely. By the way, this gives me a nice opportunity as well to say that we don't commercially recycle spent nuclear fuel in the United States, but at Idaho National Laboratory and in other places, including Savannah River, we've been recycling spent nuclear fuel for years. Earlier was mentioned the Navy, the nuclear Navy. We reprocessed Navy nuclear fuel through the early 90s. Okay. Part of the reason for doing that is that's actually high enriched uranium, so very valuable material that can be used again, even sort of more valuable than, say, low enriched uranium spent nuclear fuel. So at the lab, we reprocess or recycle the EBR-2, Experimental Breeder Reactor 2, spent fuel. That was high enriched uranium. We use a technique called pyroprocessing. It's an electrochemical process where we separate the uranium from the other materials, and then we are downblending that remaining uranium, which is still high enriched uranium, down to below 20 weight percent, which then makes it low enriched uranium, or HALEU. And we are making that material available to advanced reactor developers to support their initial cores. For a specific example, we were working with Oklo to allocate up to 5 metric tons of that material to support the first core for their demonstration reactor.
Thank you. I just want to ask you, Mr. Stetson, I appreciate the community panel perspective, and I just wonder if you want to expand your previous testimony about why it's so important to have the community panel perspective when you're talking about the long-term disposal of nuclear waste.
Certainly, happy to do that. The community really feels that the important process to go through is consolidated interim storage is a consent-based process, and really the whole purpose is to build trust. Trust in, number one, to have trust, you have to have competence in the organization that is implementing it. Number two, you really have to feel that you're working in the best interest of the community. And number three, you really have to feel that there's an open dialogue back and forth to respond to concerns of the community.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Generally, time's expired. I now recognize the chair of the full committee, Chair Rogers, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me start with you, Dr. Wagner. One of the goals of our nuclear legislation this Congress has been to unleash American nuclear innovation. And we've done this by laying the groundwork for a stronger American fuel supply, by reducing fees and increasing efficiency in licensing to assist the deployment of new technologies. Harnessing innovation really is the key to strong nuclear future. So Dr. Wagner, you talk about the realities of today's nuclear landscape versus the 80s. What do today's technologies, advanced reactors and reprocessing, offer to advance spent fuel management?
So today's, right now, we have worked over the last several decades to advance those recycling technologies to improve the characteristics that are still coming out of them. As was mentioned earlier, even with recycling, we will still have some long-lived radioactive waste that needs geologic disposal. But what we've been able to do in the last couple of decades is develop technologies that reduces that amount and reduces the characteristics of the material that would ultimately need a repository. Now, also today, we are getting very close to deploying advanced reactors with different fuel forms that, again, as was mentioned, are more favorable for recycling than our current low-enriched uranium oxide fuel.
Thank you. You indicate that Russia and China are using their recycling technologies to cement their civilian nuclear relationships concerning the management of spent fuel. What lessons should this hold for U.S. policymakers, and how does recycling enhance U.S. competitiveness?
So, for one, demonstrating leadership in what we're going to do on the back end is something that is just part of global U.S. leadership for nuclear, which we have not had since basically stalling the Yucca Mountain repository project. So there's that. Russia and China, and particularly Russia, has been offering fuel take-back as well to demonstrate that the countries that they're working with would not be saddled with the long-term storage disposal issues of the fuel that their power reactors generate.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. White, Mr. Barrett, from the testimony, it seems clear the American people have been let down. Ratepayers have spent over $40 billion with nothing to show. Taxpayers have been picking up the bill for a failed management for another $50 billion. The citizens of Nye County, Nevada, which would host the Yucca Mountain Permanent Repository, have been deprived of licensing answers they wanted to justify for their support for the site. And meanwhile, the office has been dismantled that was focused on spent fuel management. So to both of you, Mr. White, Mr. Barrett, to rebuild trust in the spent nuclear fuel program and to restart the licensing process, do you need a credible organization that manages the program?
Yes, indeed.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am, we do, and we don't have it right now.
Thank you, Mr. White. Will ratepayers support restarting the fee if there's not a credible spent fuel program?
No, we will not.
Okay. Mr. Barrett, while we may need long-term management reforms as a first step to rebuilding, does it make sense to reestablish the office at DOE the law requires to focus on spent fuel management?
Yes, I believe it should be immediately reestablished to plan to transition it out of DOE eventually.
Okay. Would you like to expand on that at all, either of you?
Yes, ma'am. I mean, we have to have a credible implementing organization to incorporate advanced technologies into the system, but we need to have a long-term disposal system. In my personal opinion, within the Department of Energy, it is not capable, under the restrictions that in reality in political world here, to be able to do the job that this country needs them to do. I think it would be much more success if we had it outside into a dedicated organization that is a partnership type of organization, as the Blue Ribbon Commission on America's Nuclear Future recommended. And I hope very much that there can be an arrangement that eventually that can use what we've learned from Yucca Mountain and possibly make an arrangement with the state of Nevada. The federal government needs Nevada, and Nevada needs the federal government.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Mr. White, is there anything you want to add?
Yes, we do need a credible program. The Department of Energy is a huge bureaucracy. There's a lot of competition within the departments or within the agencies within the department. We need a single focus organization. If we could do that with ACRWM, with this Office of Civilian Radioactive Waste Management, to separate it, that would be good, but we've been unable to do that. So the next best choice is to find an outside organization that can do that. Single purpose, highly focused on its mission.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I yield back.
Generally yields back. I now recognize the ranking member, Pallone, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to focus on the issue of spent fuel at decommissioned reactors, and this is a problem across the country, but as I mentioned in my opening statement, we have Oyster Creek. That site is not far from my congressional district. So let me ask Mr. Stetson initially. You effectively serve as the voice of the community on San Onofre. I looked it up. I looked it up. He's like some obscure Egyptian saint or something. I don't know. I've never heard of him, but whatever. On San Onofre's community engagement panel, and I'm sure you hear constantly from concerned and frustrated community residents. So let me just ask you, could you talk about the impacts that storing spent fuel on site has on the communities with decommissioned reactors?
Certainly, and number one is cost. It's very expensive to have it there. And certainly safety. The long-term safety for the spent fuel is a concern. We believe that it's stored there safely currently, but for the long term, it really needs to be moved, and that weighs on the public. And as I mentioned before, the Navy really wants the land back for to train Marines. So all of those things, but really the local community is concerned for the short term and for the long term over the safety of the spent fuel there, and they really want it out.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, of course, it makes it impossible to redevelop as well, but I think the concern is more about the safety than the future use of the property, frankly. I also wanted to talk a little bit about the importance of creating interim storage sites, because I think that's much more likely than, Yucca Mountain. So, Mr. Stetson, could you talk about how the Biden administration's actions setting up a pathway for a consent-based siting process will be essential to getting waste out of the communities as quickly as possible, referencing interim sites?
Certainly. I think that it's on an excellent path. I mean, most recently, they have distributed, I believe, $26 million, $2 million each to 13 different communities, universities, and the like, to start the discussion about hosting spent fuel in there, not necessarily to have it there, but to start the discussion. And that's really the first step that the administration is taking. First of a number of steps to determine where we might be able to first establish consent-based siting. And I think that's really a very important step to get the community involved, to listen to them, and to listen to their concerns, and to adapt accordingly.
All right. Well, thank you. Let me go to Mr. Barrett. You talked about your experience working on spent fuel at DOE, and that consent-based siting gets the buy-in of impacted state and local governments and tribes, and maybe is the most promising way forward. Can you talk about the importance of these consent-based processes and getting the buy-in, and how that makes proposed solutions, again, interim, I'm assuming some kind of interim storage site, and speak about how to ensure that those solutions hold up long-term, because, politics change, different people come into office, if you would.
Yes, sir. I think it's very critical that we have the principles of consent-based siting in siting any of our nuclear facilities going forward. So that is a fundamental basics. I think to have that, you have to have a credible organization. You have to have trust and confidence in that organization, whomever it is. And it's not just a transfer of problem from one community to another community. I believe for consent-based siting for interim storage, it's critical that any receiving state knows that that is going to truly be temporary, meaning it's not going to stay there forever, like it's kind of been stuck now. So I think a critical part is there has to be a credible geologic disposal system to back up interim storage somewhere, because you're just transferring the canisters from one community to another community. And why would a state want to accept that without assurance that the government or its agent is going to perform in the future? So I think consent-based siting is a mechanism that we can use to build the trust and confidence in interim storage, but also connected with the disposal in a consent-based approach for disposal as well. So it works in both places, and they have to go in tandem or they're going to fail.
No, I agree, and not to be so cynical, but having been here a few years, Yucca Mountain we talked about so much, then we talked about interim in New Mexico and other places, and it was always a problem because there wasn't local support. So thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the ranking member. I now go to Mr. Latta for 5 minutes.
Well, thanks, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for holding today's hearing. This is a topic that I've been interested in, not only interested in, but something that we've got to really think about in this country, because as the witnesses in their testimony have stated about on the nuclear side and where we are with our reactors and with the power that's being generated, and we're talking about carbon-free out there, that it's absolutely essential where we're going with on the nuclear side. And as already been mentioned about Yucca Mountain, I think all of us have been out there, and I say it's probably the most expensive large hole I've ever been in the United States that has been put out there, but and nothing's happened. So, one of the things that, I started talking about with, especially with the French, is what they've been doing with that spent nuclear fuel. And I think that the the member of the subcommittee had mentioned that she's already been there, and I think it's important. But if I could just go to Dr. Wagner, again, and in your testimony, when you state that in 1976, President Ford deferred plans for commercial nuclear fuel recycling because of uncertainties associated with the technical feasibility and proliferation concerns. And then President Carter, after that, announced he would indefinitely defer on it. One of the things I asked at one of our hearings, it was last year, when we were talking about what we could do about maybe following France's lead on this. And this was, well, it's very expensive. But now we're talking about something that happened in 1976, so 48 years ago, to where we are today. What's the feasibility of being able to go forward and start saying, what, we can go. And also, one last thing, when I was at a facility last year, they told me that they believe that we've got enough spent rods out there that could produce fuel for 100 years in this country. So, from where when we were being talked about that in 1976 to where we are today, and of course, they say, well, maybe we're too far behind. But can we and should we in this country look at recycling those rods and for that spent fuel?
So I think we can, and I think we should. If you think about the timeline, when we had a prohibition for recycling, it was shortly after that the Nuclear Waste Policy Act was drafted. So that was kind of the backdrop of it. And I would argue that recycling, or not against recycling, was baked into the Nuclear Waste Policy Act. As was mentioned several times, each of the utilities has signed a standard contract with the Department of Energy to take their spent fuel away from them. They have not been able to meet that obligation, and therefore they've been sued by the utilities and so on, which has been discussed. But that kind of construct provides no financial or otherwise incentive for recycling. So this really becomes a policy question, and how we need to revise the Nuclear Waste Policy Act in a number of different ways. Providing access to the waste fund, for example, outside of appropriations. There's a number of different ways that I think we need to modify the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, but this would be one of them as well, is to provide some opening, some mechanism that then a private sector can decide whether it economically makes sense or not. But right now, there's really no incentive there.
For the United States to move forward on this, has anybody ever even done any calculation what the cost would be? Because if we'd, it's always like if you're a day behind if you didn't get started today. So what is there kind of any definitive study out there that might say this is how much it would cost for us to go out there and start recycling these rods?
So there's a lot of studies, and they have different variations. It's a large number in terms of what it would cost, but it also depends. The size of the number depends a lot on how much of that material we would recycle. Would we focus on advanced reactors with high SALEU, or would we try to do it all, or would we try to do some portion of it? And so, to give you an answer, it's highly variable, but it's a very large number. And so that's where we are now, and there's really, in some ways, no point to go further until we understand, can there be a policy that would support doing that in the first place. One other point I'd like to make is that if we're just declining or stable in nuclear energy in this country, it really makes no sense to invest in the infrastructure that it would take to recycle. So therefore, there's really been no impetus to change. However, now as we look at potentially tripling our nuclear capacity by 2050, that would warrant a different look, and that would warrant investment in such technologies, in my opinion.
Well, thank you. Mr. Chairman, my time has just expired, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Peters, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The San Onofre Generating Station, as we mentioned before, is just north of my district in San Diego, and sits on the most beautiful stretch of the San Diego, California coast, within 100 feet of the Pacific Ocean, and near dense population centers, near an active military base, and near multiple fault lines. Not the best place for nuclear storage, I think we would all agree. As Mr. Stetson said, our constituents are anxious to see it moved. We hope to advance the development of both inner storage and a permanent storage site as soon as possible, and have long supported federal efforts to do so. The lack of interim and permanent storage facilities poses an immediate and significant threat to my constituents and other communities around the country, like the chairman himself referenced. If we're going to continue encouraging the development of domestic next-generation nuclear technologies to meet an extremely growing load, a load that's for a demand for electricity that's growing very quickly, we're going to need to deal with this issue. And I would just say, too, I know there's not a lot of enthusiasm among states to accept any amount of spent nuclear fuel. It's clear to me that we are on this path toward consent-based siting. I've expressed my skepticism about that in this room before, but that's the path we're on. But let me just talk a little bit with Mr. Stetson. I think you addressed this a little bit, but in terms of the risks, the health risks of having this where it is, can you just give us a little sense of how you assess those right now, and then maybe how those risks would compare if they were moved to interim storage or permanent repository like Yucca Mountain or someplace else?
Well, in terms of risks, we believe that I think in general, there's consensus that the spent fuel stored at San Onofre is currently safe. But there's 123 canisters there. But if it's there forever, you're going to need to repackage it. Right. So in order to do that, you're going to have to remove it from the area where it's currently stalled. You're going to need to open it, and you're going to need to repackage it. In order to do that, you're going to need a hot cell. And hot cell is a very expensive proposition. So long-term, I think it's something that's a potential risk, and certainly something that we want to move it out of there as soon as possible.
You and I completely agree on that. I'm not as rosy on the idea of a consent-based siting as I mentioned before. And I asked Mr. White, how was Yucca Mountain chosen as a long-term storage site, and how many facilities like it exist in the United States from a geological perspective?
Well, there are no facilities like, there are no other facilities that are being considered at this point. As Mr. Barrett noted, it was a congressional designation, and then further in 2002 when the Secretary of Energy designated Yucca Mountain to be the national repository. We believe that the science that was done there was very, very valuable and should not be thrown out. In other words, there's value to learning from what happened at Yucca Mountain. NARUC takes the position that the license review should consider, even if the repository were determined to be non-licensable at Yucca Mountain, there's tremendous value to learning from that experience. If we throw that out, we're starting back at scratch, and that doesn't make sense.
I completely agree. I think that's what Ranking Member DeGette was talking about with stopping the inquiry. I don't think that makes any sense. I was in local government, and I know the resistance to building a condo project. This is a nuclear waste siting facility. I went to Yucca Mountain. If I recall, it's 1,000 feet above the water table, 1,000 feet below the ground, and there's nothing around it. And I think while consent-based ideas are admirable, you have to start with the geology. I mean, ultimately, it's got to be a safe place. And if someone in Mr. Pfluger's district was decided that they wanted to welcome it for some payment of money, we'd still really be concerned about what the geology was, whether that supported it. And we've done a lot of work to identify Yucca Mountain as a place where it would be acceptable. So it's not going away. I think ultimately, after we play out this consent-based process, which I've supported and I've voted for money for, despite my skepticism, because I want to be a team player and I want to resolve this issue. I think we're going to come back to Yucca Mountain because I think it's the place that makes the most sense. And sometimes from a national perspective, security, scientific, safety, That's the role of the federal government. It's to go beyond local objections, which in this case I think we can meet. But I certainly appreciate everyone's interest here. I like the idea of an independent organization. It seems to be a consensus on that, and would love to work with the chairman and the members of this subcommittee to see that happen, if that would be helpful as well. Mr. Chairman, thank you for having the hearing, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from California. I was on that trip with you to Yucca Mountain. I remember Congressman Mark Sanford standing there and saying, if we can't put the nuclear waste here, we're not going to put it anywhere. And so your points are very valid. I'll now go to Mr. Wahlberg for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to the panel for being here. And thanks to some of my colleagues for not showing up, so it gets me on questioning a little earlier than planned. Hey, that's just fact, okay? We appreciate the panel, and a special welcome to one of our former Michigan Public Service Commissioners, Mr. White. Thank you for being here. My district has 2 nuclear plants on either coast, the coast being Lake Michigan and Lake Erie. And another just north of my district, Palisades, that is in the process of being, I'm glad, brought back online in some way, shape, or form. Nuclear power will be a major player in Michigan's energy mix for many years to come. For that reason, we must figure out a long-term solution for nuclear waste. Michiganders have contributed about $2 billion to the Nuclear Waste Fund to remove our spent fuel. That price is only going to keep going up. I appreciate that the chairman holding the hearing today to discuss this important issue. Mr. White, you testified before this subcommittee on May 15th, 2015, back when you were a member of the Michigan Public Service Commission. In your testimony, you said, and I quote, "It's clear that the U.S. still lacks a nuclear waste program, and after taking billions into the Nuclear Waste Fund, the government has," and quote again, "absolutely nothing to show for this vast collection of ratepayers' money." Can you briefly tell me what has changed since you made those remarks 9 years ago?
Unfortunately, nothing.
I was afraid you'd say that. Again, Mr. White, in your testimony today, you state that the Congress should consider assigning management for used fuel management to a new organization outside of the Department of Energy. Why is the DOE not up to the task, and how would this new organization work differently?
Right. Excuse me. Thank you so much for the question. And feasibly, the Department of Energy should be able to tackle this. But as I mentioned in my earlier remarks, there's a lot of competition within the department for the dollars. And despite the fact that the Nuclear Waste Fund is a dedicated fund intended solely for the purpose of characterizing and developing a waste repository, the Office of Civilian Radioactive Waste Management still had to compete for dollars, funding dollars, through the appropriations process. Our view is that if you have an organization that is outside of that process, that has access to those funds and is dedicated to the mission of the repository, that you're going to get a better result than one that is in competition with other agencies within the department.
And ratepayer interests will be protected, you believe?
We believe that they would, because once again, there would not be, or the fund would be available to the repository as needed. And we do have some ideas as to how that would work.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Barrett, I support the completion of licensing Yucca Mountain. If Yucca Mountain was completed today, would it be sufficient to store all of our nation's spent fuel?
It would be technically sufficient to do so. It is limited by law. It only can take half of it until a second repository starts.
Mr. Barrett, your testimony calls on Congress to begin working on a second repository.
Yes, sir.
As you've just stated. Why should we start that now, and what do we need to do to avoid the stalemate we find ourselves in with Yucca?
This nation needs a disposal capability under any circumstances regarding new nuclear coming forward in advances in reprocessing. We need a geologic disposal facility. Yucca Mountain is politically blocked. It's been politically blocked for 14 years. I hope it can be unblocked, but it's not. All right, so we should start looking for another repository. The original act had 2 repositories. So let's start that process in a consent-based siting process. I believe that it's necessary for success for interim storage consent-based siting to have a responsible, capable, meaningful, realistic disposal facility in the process of being created. Without that, I can't see any state accepting interim storage for everybody else's waste from around the country.
Politics still way out there.
Yes, sir. Politics is very important. This is not a technical problem. This is a social political problem.
We can do it.
Yes,
That's
we
the
can
problem.
do it. I know we can do it in this country.
Okay. Thanks for reiterating that, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize Ms. Matsui for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I think we can all agree that the status quo, where spent fuel is stored indefinitely at current and former power plants, is not a serious long-term solution for nuclear waste. Not only is this not a long-term solution, it is the most inefficient and costly way to store spent fuel. It's simply unfair to the communities, as we've heard before, where this waste is stored. Mr. Stetson, how much does it cost to store the spent fuel at the former San Onofre nuclear plant?
Thank you for the question. There's 2 types of storage units. There's the horizontal, which are the Riva, and there's the vertical, which are the Holtec. And for the infrastructure to build those was $295 million. It's currently costing about $20 million a year to maintain those facilities, and should, due to climate change, rising water tables, things like that, if they are required to move that to higher ground, it would cost probably in today's dollars over $175 million.
Okay. In my district, it costs $6.2 million every year to store the spent fuel at Rancho Seco. And as my colleagues have noted, this can add up to $1 billion per year for the federal government. DOE currently estimates that it will cost American taxpayers $51 billion in total. But, Mr. Barrett, you write in your testimony that $51 billion is likely an underestimate. In fact, if we don't change current policy, taxpayers will continue paying out hundreds of millions of dollars every year indefinitely. Is that right?
It's going to increase, yes, ma'am.
Okay. For those looking to reduce federal spending, removing the spent fuel from these sites, including from Rancho Seco in my district, will save the American taxpayer tens of billions of dollars. In fact, the Blue Ribbon Commission and the 2021 GAO report on commercial spent nuclear fuel both concluded that just moving spent fuel to a consolidated interim storage site could save taxpayers billions of dollars. And it's not just about saving money. There's been a lot of excitement about the next generation of advanced reactors. But many communities interested in hosting a new nuclear plant may encounter opposition if they're stuck with the waste forever. Mr. Barrett, in your testimony, you write that the future of nuclear power depends on public trust that we will be environmentally responsible in our actions. Are you concerned that the current impasse on waste will hinder the construction of future power plants?
Yes, ma'am. I think it's a very important factor for us going forward. We must have national trust and confidence that we will have a disposal path forward, regardless of the advances in technologies for this material. We don't have it now. And why should a community trust the government in the future when we haven't done so well?
Yes, and Mr. Stetson, given your experience with San Onofre, would you expect the current policy failure on nuclear waste to affect communities' interest in hosting a new nuclear plant?
Absolutely. As Mr. Barrett said, the trust has been shattered. Unless you have the trust of the local community, they're going to put up barriers and do everything they can to block any future facilities in their location.
Okay. Thanks to consistent congressional direction and funding in FY 21, 22, and 23, and 24, DOE has made significant progress in developing and implementing a roadmap for consent-based siting of consolidated interim storage. Mr. Barrett, you provided several recommendations in your testimony, including for DOE to continue the interim storage siting program. In your opinion, should this committee support continued funding for these programs?
Yes.
Okay. Beyond the current interim storage program, DOE also needs to expand its efforts to develop a comprehensive waste management plan for the transportation, interim storage, and disposal of spent fuel. And for this, DOE needs additional direction from Congress. Mr. Barrett, I think you might have answered this, but we can talk about it again. You also recommended DOE prepare an overall waste management strategy and start a consent-based siting program for a second repository. Is this something that you truly do advocate for, and do you believe that this will start the process in a direction that might move us off certain areas that we have been fighting about for a long time? And also, if we do this, do you believe that we can start, you're talking about building trust. I think that's really something that we really need to do. And I think it's really necessary today because many people's opinion have changed about the importance of nuclear power for the future, which I think is a good start. And in order for this to happen, even with all the technological advances, the trust part is going to be very important. So do you believe that just moving forward on this will be helpful in this?
Yes, we need to move forward, but what's missing in an integrated plan is the Department of Energy has no plans right now for the geologic disposal component, which is a critical, fundamental, foundational component that we do not have. They are doing consent-based siting for interim storage only.
Okay.
That is why I strongly urge this committee and the Department of Energy to start a process to work on geologic disposal, Yucca Mountain or not. We must have that as a foundational piece in our programs going forward.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and I yield back.
John Lay yields back. Before you do, you had something you wanted to submit for the record. Was that part of an opening statement, or? It was, that I will be submitting later. Okay, without objection, so ordered. So I'll now go to Mr. Griffith for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing, and I thank our witnesses for being here today. Mr. Chairman, I have to tell you, I understand there's already been a lot of discussion about recycling of the nuclear waste, and I'm very supportive of recycling. I think that makes sense. I remember Ed Whitfield, who used to serve on this committee with us, was a big proponent of that, and they had a facility they wish he wanted us to invest in it back then, and I think a lot of us today recognize we probably should have in the recycling of nuclear waste. I'm also very supportive of Yucca Mountain and going forward with that. I know there are others who disagree, but that's where I stand. And I understand, gentlemen, and I'm going to go to Mr. White with the question, but I understand that there's a settlement that was made because they've been collecting the fees and not doing anything with the waste management, and that payments are to be made out of the Treasury Department to pay for the failure to uphold the waste management contracts that were previously entered into in order to resolve this. Now, when Treasury goes to pay that money, do you think that the money should come out of the DOE Nuclear Waste Fund, or should it come from somewhere else?
It should not come out of the Nuclear Waste Fund, because the Nuclear Waste Fund was created for the sole purpose, very specific purpose, of characterizing a potential repository and then developing and constructing a repository. So that would not fit within that.
And we still need to be able to do that. And in fact, as we've heard from Mr. Barrett, we want to start working on a second one, even though we haven't actually started using the first one. Is that correct?
It is correct.
All right. I appreciate that. I appreciate you all. Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to yield my time to you or to any other member who might wish to have some
I
time.
appreciate the gentleman yielding. Mr. White, will you walk me through how the Nuclear Waste Fund works?
I'm sorry?
Will you walk me through how the Nuclear Waste Fund works?
Yeah, so the Nuclear Waste Fund, again, it was, is part of the standard contracts that the Department of Energy were required to sign with the nuclear utilities, the utilities that own nuclear power generation. There would be a 1 mil per kilowatt hour fee that would be baked into that rate approved by the Public Utility Commissions so that money could be collected from the nuclear utilities through their ratepayers, through their customers, and then submitted to the federal government.
Ratepayer money, not taxpayer money. So the fund was set up, ratepayers would pay for the management and disposal of spent nuclear fuel, and it's amassed, what, almost 50 billion?
It's roughly 50 billion. There's been something north of 12 billion that was spent on the characterization of the Yucca Mountain facility. So overall, there's more, but the current balance is roughly $50 billion.
Yeah, and as I understand, the program's been hampered by reliable funding. Congress has trouble accessing the fund to pay for spent fuel management. The problem is, under budget laws, spending on the repository program is considered discretionary spending and is subject to spending caps. So this has limited what Congress spends. If Congress were able to fix the funding problem, would some of the other problems with putting a repository program back together be reduced?
I believe that the answer to that is yes.
Yeah. We've heard a lot about, in my remaining time, about a second repository. That means more ratepayer fees collected into a fund. And we've seen failure by the federal government to spend that money appropriately. God, I just can't. So to the panel, when I hear suggestions to form a new organization to manage waste, they included a requirement to have access to the fund. Is it fair that access should not be hindered by current budget constraints? That's to everyone.
Yes.
Dr. Wagner, Mr. Barrett?
Yes, it has to work within a budget system. I believe the interest on the fund is certainly sufficient to start the process before we need to use the
Mr.
corpus.
Stetson?
I would concur.
Yeah. Mr. White?
Yes, full access of the corpus of the nuclear waste fund should be made available.
Yeah. Dr. Wagner, in the remaining 50 seconds here, what's the difference between the work that Curio's doing with, is it OLO or one of the other companies there at the site? What's the difference in the work they're doing?
So there's a few different companies. I think you're referring probably to Curio and Oklo.
Okay. Yeah.
Curio is developing their technology, and it relates more to other people's spent fuel, or various utilities spent fuel, with a strong focus on low enriched uranium and taking the value of it. Oklo is more focused, and we're working with them, as was referenced, is more focused on recycling their own fuel from their own reactors that they're intending to deploy, potentially then expanding to other reactors, but their primary focus is on theirs, and which means then that they're focused on high SALEU. They're focused on their fuel technology, which kind of pairs very well to pyroprocessing, which is something that we've worked on at the laboratory for many years. I do want to mention that we continue to recycle fuel right now. I'd love to invite any of the members to come visit to actually see what it looks like. A number of you have mentioned visiting Yucca Mountain, visiting spent fuel sites, commercial utilities. Happy to have you come visit and see exactly what this looks like.
Yeah. Last question, Mr. Stetson. You mentioned the fuel that was spent, stored vertically and horizontally in California. Is that dry cast storage or is that wet pole storage?
It's dry.
Dry. Okay. Thank you. With that, I will go to Mr. Tonko for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Over the years, I have been supportive of the committee's efforts to solve our nation's nuclear waste challenges. And I do strongly believe that all members, regardless of their feelings about the future of nuclear power, should recognize that we have a responsibility to address the waste that already exists. Today, there is a lot of excitement around new advanced reactor designs. So, Dr. Wagner, will advanced reactors have the same issues with waste as we have experience with light water reactors?
So they will have the same issues in terms of the socio-political challenges we've been talking about in terms of having a management and disposition program for that material.
Thank you. And I know several witnesses have discussed already the opportunity for reprocessing and recycling spent fuel as is currently done in France. But again, to Dr. Wagner, I was pleased that your testimony mentioned that the United States has a history of commercial reprocessing, which occurred in West Valley, New York. The West Valley project ultimately failed for a litany of reasons, and today that site is home to significant waste and in need of major remediation. It is estimated that the cost of that cleanup will be several $billion. And there has been a long-standing disagreement over who bears responsibility for that cost, although I believe it has been adequately proven that the overwhelming majority of that waste came from defense-related activities, and therefore DOE should be responsible. Reprocessing capabilities could be a good addition to our domestic nuclear industry, but I do not want it to be suggested that this would completely solve our waste challenges or that it is without risk. So while I'm certain that the there's interest in better understanding the benefits and what it would take from Congress to jumpstart domestic reprocessing capabilities, I think we need to be clear about a couple of things. First, there must be a regulatory framework that adequately addresses the risks in such a commercial project, including who should have liability for future remediation activities. And second, we need to definitively address the legacy of our nation's last foray into reprocessing. So, Dr. Wagner, do you have any recommendations on how we should evaluate the risks and necessary incentives to encourage the reprocessing and recycling of spent fuel?
So in terms of evaluating the risks, we do have NRC licensing related to these kinds of things. There is some updates there that, as I put in my written testimony, would be appropriate. So that's the kind of risks I think about in that regard. In terms of policy, I mentioned that we really have no policy mechanisms to promote it, so I'd like to open that up and make that an option. But ultimately, it's going to come down to either economics on the private side or federal policy if we decide to recycle. I will note that many members have mentioned that France recycles today. They do that as a federal government policy. They do not do that because it's economic to do so. They've made a policy to do that. So I just wanted to flag that.
Thank you. And do any of our other members of the panel have opinions as to how Congress should consider the potential for reprocessing?
I believe that Congress should investigate and keep up with the advances in technology, as Dr. Wagner has stated. But we also need to do this in an integrated manner, looking at the whole package, including in France, for example. They do have a disposal program that is advanced there using their political system. We don't have that here. So you need to look at it in total.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Stetson?
Only that if we pursue that we still need the back end to store it at some place after it's reprocessed, but neutral on the stand itself.
But you see it as a complementary piece, potentially?
Potentially.
Yes. And Mr. White?
Yeah, Congressman Tonko, thank you for the question, because I really think that what needs to be important here is when you're comparing the economics of reprocessing, you're not simply comparing it to mining and enriching uranium or buying uranium off the market. To the extent that technologies, reprocessing technologies can reduce the volume of waste to be stored, it should be evaluated as part of the entire fuel cycle for nuclear power. And the economics, I think, are going to change very dramatically when you're comparing building successive repositories versus only having to build a single repository or fewer repositories in order to store a lower volume of waste.
Okay, I appreciate that. And with that, I say thank you to the panel, and Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now go to Chair of the Health Subcommittee, Mr. Guthrie, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. And you mentioned the Health Subcommittee, which is currently meeting, so I've been back and forth, so I apologize, because I know this is very, very important. And I don't know a scenario that we get the lower carbon that people are seeking without including nuclear in the mix. My understanding nuclear is about 99% efficient. Wind and solar is about 35%. So you need 3 times the windmills to do the same thing that a nuclear. I said, well, but you can't stack windmills. So it's either you could have 100% if the wind's not blowing, it's not blowing. So you absolutely have to have base load power, and we have to become realistic about it. And this is a way to go, but it does need to make sense, and there are issues that we have to deal with. So, Dr. Wagner, we talked about spent fuels and reprocessing. Where does it make economic sense to apply reprocessing to spent rods?
So it would make the most economic sense if we, as was mentioned earlier, if we factored in the overall integrated costs for what it will take to ultimately dispose of the materials, which we do not currently do today. So if we were comparing it to not just mining and processing uranium, but the entire fuel cycle, I can't say that would still make it economically viable. It would make it more favorable. Those analyses would have to be done. The next area that kind of enables it to look more economically favorable is that this new fuels for advanced reactors, high SALEU, there is a greater value in the content of those materials when they are discharged than our current reactors do. So that's another positive kind of indicator towards making recycling more economic. Third, I would say with the global interest in nuclear power, we are seeing the prices of uranium increase dramatically. I think we're at about a 15 or 16-year high for the cost of uranium. If that continues, that will also affect the economics of recycling.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. White, Kentucky currently doesn't have nuclear power, so I tell you, my area, Bowling Green, was one of the fastest growing cities in the South region, is going to be limited eventually because TVA is taking fossil fuels off the marketplace. They say they won't, but I can tell you, we know for a fact our economic development people are concerned about just power in terms, and I think the whole country needs to be concerned about that. We haven't had that issue for a while, but if we don't permit new sources, we're going to be limited to what we have. And so if we move to, so as a representative of the ratepayers, as Kentucky, if it moves to nuclear, what are some of the costs that you know the ratepayer is going to have to absorb? What do they need to be aware of in an economic sense, just to get started?
Well, we've said many times that the ratepayers have paid and paid and paid and paid, and where I'm coming from there is the ratepayers pay for the original design of the waste storage at the nuclear power plants when they're constructed, the spent fuel pools that are there. As the federal program failed to remove the waste, those spent fuel pools had to be reconfigured in order to be able to take more waste. When those pools became full, the waste had to be removed and to a dry cask storage. The ratepayers paid for each step of that way while also continuing to pay into the nuclear waste fund. So the ratepayers have paid multiple times for essentially the same thing.
Okay, so I represent Paradise, which is famous in a John Prine song, but it was literally is where a coal company or a coal plant was taken out of business. And so the question that, do you think so Mr. White or any of you, that using areas that already have energy infrastructure but have been taken out of business is a good way to start in terms of nuclear power? That give you a head start if you want to move forward with that? I don't know if Dr. Wagner or Mr. White are willing to talk about that.
Yeah, well, I'll just say yes, absolutely. There's been a number of studies looking at repowering those coal sites, either ones that have retired or will be retiring with advanced nuclear. I think it makes a lot of sense for a lot of reasons. Just a couple of those reasons would be, one, you've already got the transmission distribution infrastructure there. Generally, you have some sort of heat sink for that system that was previously there, and you've got a community and a piece of land there that is favorable.
Okay, Mr. White, do you have a comment on that?
Yes, the communities that host these facilities are generally comfortable with them. They're good neighbors. The nuclear power plants and the other energy facilities, including coal plants, they're good neighbors, and the communities are comfortable with them. So it makes a lot of sense to take advantage of not only that familiarity with the energy systems and energy production, but also the infrastructure that already is there in place. And so you don't have to start from scratch on a greenfield site.
Thank you. My time has expired. I apologize. I'm going back to Health Committee, but I yield back, and I appreciate the time you guys have here.
Appreciate the gentleman's questions. He yields back. I'll now go to Ms. Castor for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses, and I really appreciate the engagement of our colleagues. It's a good bipartisan hearing. The Inflation Reduction Act provided some new incentives for nuclear energy, incentives for advanced nuclear deployment, and also the HALEU. I heard Mr. Barrett say that unless we find a solution for managing the spent fuel in a reasonable and sustainable way, we're not going to be able to predict any trajectory for advanced nuclear. Dr. Wagner, do you agree with that?
I don't know that I would say we're not going to be able to predict any trajectory. We are seeing new nuclear power be built, Vogtle Units 3 and 4 as a case, as well as repurposing a coal site in Kemmer, Wyoming, and other things. So we are seeing nuclear move forward despite not having a national program for the waste, but it certainly is an impediment. It certainly adds a lot of uncertainty to any utility, any community, any energy investor that would want to move forward with such a project.
And I've been trying to picture what this means in the real world. In my neck of the woods in Florida, we have a decommissioned nuclear power plant about 90 miles north of the Tampa Bay area at Crystal River, and they have They're doing dry cask storage. I guess they recently have segmented the portion of the former reactor and fuel, and it is sitting there. It's hard for me to conceptualize that this spent fuel would travel out of the dry cask that's there to an interim storage facility or all the way to Yucca Mountain from Florida. What is your view for the future of that spent fuel in the dry cask there?
Well, so there, by the way, there are about 20 different sites in the country that no longer have power generation, but have these kinds of facilities like Crystal River and various stages of decommissioning the original plant. Some stages where all that's left is the spent fuel. So they are primarily, not all, but primarily in what is referred to as dual-purpose canisters. And so what you've got is an internal steel canister that the spent nuclear fuel assemblies are within, and that is placed in a larger, typically concrete overpack for shielding purposes. And so that those canisters would be pulled out, put into a transportation type of overpack and transported. So those systems that are at Crystal River and that are at other places, most of them, not all of them, but most of them actually are designed to be transported to a final repository.
Okay, Mr. Barrett, do you agree with that? Would it be safe to transport? We have, spent fuel stored at 75 different sites in 33 different states, including 23 sites that are no longer operating.
Yes, ma'am. This is not a technical problem. The technology is there to safely transport these materials to wherever its destination would be.
How would what's the scenario? By rail?
Those large canisters that most of them are today, we have 4,000, I think almost 4,100 of them stored. Those most are dual purpose, meaning they can be, the canisters are pulled out, put in a special NRC, certified, Nuclear Regulatory Commission certified cask, and be safely transported. The French do thousands of these shipments, and we've done many of these shipments for 50 years safely. So that is not a problem technically at all. Where to take it to is our problem.
Okay. Mr. White, what would that mean for cost for consumers? Ultimately, there are enormous costs for keeping these on site, but there are enormous costs for transporting it. What's your view on that?
Sure. In the long run, by having a solution, by having a federal repository, it will reduce the costs overall. We're basically, without having that program, we're just going to continue to incur costs indefinitely.
Okay. Do you want to add? What's your view on the safe transport out and the cost issue for consumers?
Yes, I would concur with everything that's been said. Also, it's important to note that the Navy is currently moving spent fuel without any problems whatsoever. And with reference to commercial spent fuel, I believe the DOE is moving forward with what's called the Atlas Rail Car to move it safely. So all of those things are underway.
Thank you very much. I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. I now go to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Balderson, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here today. I'll start with Mr. White. Mr. White, just last month, PJM Independent Market Monitor released a report estimating between 43 and 58 gigawatts of capacity are at risk of retirement by 2030. I believe it's important that we as a committee express concerns about policies such as EPA's Section 111 rule that drive existing reliable generation off the grid. But I also believe it's important we look at all available reliable sources, including nuclear, that can provide reliable energy for generations to come. In terms of improving the reliability of the grid and embracing advanced nuclear technologies, why is solving the spent nuclear fuel problem once and for all so important?
Well, you pretty much answered the question in the way the question was posed. We are facing a tremendous increase in demand, electricity demand in this country. And as we are transitioning from the traditional fossil fuel over to other technologies, having a baseload quality generation that you get from nuclear is critical to that. It is emissions-free. It's not inexpensive, but certainly the the technology is able to solve a lot of our problems in terms of maintaining reliability and security on the grid.
Okay, thank you. I'll do a follow-up with you also, sir. The problem would be solved if Congress and the executive branch implemented the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, but there should be a way to develop bipartisan support for some practical reforms to restart this program, as I understand this committee has done in the past. You indicated, Mr. White, that your association has been at the table from the beginning and that you continue to believe that the ratepayers have a role to play for the management of used fuel from which they benefited. We've talked about this through the hearing. What more would you want this subcommittee to take away? What is needed for getting the program to work?
One of the most important things from our perspective, obviously, is that the funds that have been dedicated to this be specifically dedicated to the program. It's currently accruing more than $1 billion a year in interest, and we believe that that's funds that could be used to start up various efforts without needing to go back and restart the Nuclear Waste Fund. It's our view that that fund, there should be progress made towards the permanent repository before we even have a conversation about starting up the Nuclear Waste Fund.
Okay, thank you. My next question is to Mr. Barrett. Mr. Barrett, thank you for being here today. The law establishes federal responsibility for the ultimate disposal of spent fuel. Even though the program is essentially dormant, federal responsibility remains the law. Mr. Barrett, could the Department of Energy undertake action today to address its responsibilities, such as working out agreements with the host state as envisioned in the law? And then I'll follow up with that. And if the Department of Energy were serious about this, would this be something it could start doing to implement the law?
Yes, the Secretary of Energy could take the initiative to engage with any host and work this, and Nevada would be the first place I hope she would speak to. I testified to that fact here 5 years ago in this committee, urging the Secretary to move forward with this. She is not.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Wagner, I can't leave you out, and we have some time. I'd like to discuss how we can enhance our commercial recycling capabilities. You note that changes to the existing regulatory framework for commercial recycling facilities may be needed, including updating Part 70. Can you expand on what changes you think would be beneficial to licensed nuclear fuel recycling so America can become a global leader in this space?
So actually, I'm not terribly familiar with the details on that, so I'm not the best person to probably answer that question. But there are differences that need to be clarified between Part 70 and Part 50 in terms of licensing these facilities, and then much has already been written on that, but I can share that with you.
Would the gentleman yield the balance of his time for a quick question?
Yes, I yield my balance of my time.
Thank you. Mr. White, can the money from the Nuclear Waste Fund be used for transportation of the spent fuel from the commercial sites to a repository?
I believe that that's part of the management, yes.
Okay, that was just clarification for me. Gentleman yields back, and I'll now recognize the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Fletcher, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As we've been discussing throughout this morning, the United States uses nuclear fuel to power our economy and our national defense. Nuclear spent fuel policy has been a long-standing issue that Congress has failed to address adequately. I think that has been made clear again this morning. And even though Congress formally established the nation's nuclear waste policy with the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, which established the DOE program and objectives identified later, and later identified Yucca Mountain as the site for further study for the first national repository for spent nuclear fuel. As we've discussed throughout the morning, the progress on Yucca Mountain has been stalled for more than a decade, and spent fuel continues to pile up at reactors across the country. It's now stored, as we've heard this morning, in 33 different states at 75 different sites, many of which are no longer operating. And recent court challenges to the siting of interim storage facilities have made this ad hoc system for waste storage even more uncertain. A recent GAO report has recommended that Congress amend the NWPA to authorize new consent-based siting process and direct DOE to develop and implement an integrated waste management strategy. So I look forward to discussing and hearing from you all how we can best update the NWPA today. And I want to thank you all for your testimony so far because we've covered a lot of these topics. But I do want to follow up on a couple of things. And Mr. Barrett, in particular, in your testimony, you described the U.S. nuclear spent fuel waste program as non-functional and incapable of appropriately supporting the nation's crucial needs. Do you agree with the GAO's conclusion that additional siting authority is needed for interim storage? And what other authorizations are needed by DOE to update the NWPA?
The system has to change. Department of Energy needs to do different things with host states. Consent-based siting is a good part of that, and the Blue Ribbon Commission recommendations. As far as specific statute change, a lot can be done under the existing statute with congressional support. So, but there has to be a willingness of the Department of Energy or the Congress to get them or get some new organization to basically do their job as it relates to disposal.
Well, and Mr. Stetson, I don't know if you want to weigh in on that, but I also noticed that in your testimony you mentioned successful policy that's developing in other nations, including Finland and Canada. So maybe you could weigh in on that question and also what you think we should be looking at from other countries' successful programs when we're considering updating the NWPA.
Sure, happy to do that. Thank you for the question. I think Finland is a great example of how consent-based siting, how that process works. They've been very good at working. The company in particular is named Posiva, and they have been very good in terms of working themselves into the basic fabric of the community. Many of the citizens there are work in the industry or their neighbors work in the industry, so they trust it. And ultimately, they're very involved. The community's been engaged. They answer their questions when they're asked of them. They adapt. And the bottom line is that they are proud to have this facility in their neighborhood.
Okay.
If I could add to that, Finland does not have states. It's a country of 5 million people. And if we had that here, we would have a fully operating system right now today, but we don't.
Well, that's true. That's about the size of Harris County, Mr. Chairman, which you just visited this week. So certainly understand the challenges there in our much larger system with many competing and challenging interests. And that's one of the things I want to follow up on, because also in your testimony, Mr. Stetson, you recommended kind of revisiting the linkage between the consolidated interim storage and permanent disposal. So can you expand on that a little bit, on the interplay between each other and why both are necessary in the 30 seconds we have left?
Certainly. Well, I think we all agree that we need something long-term, permanent, but that's going to be many, many decades away. And for the communities such as those around Southern California and Songs, they just can't wait that long. They really need it out of there much sooner than many, many decades.
Okay. Well, I don't know if anyone else wants to take 10 seconds to respond to that, and otherwise I will yield back.
I guess I'll just add a couple of points. One is, we're having a lot of these conversations that have been going on for over a decade. The Blue Ribbon Commission report for America's Nuclear Future was put out more than 10 years ago, and it addresses a lot of these things that we're talking about. So I just wanted to remind everybody of that. The other thing is we do
I'm going to need to yield back to my chairman, so hopefully someone else will let you finish that additional thought.
Julie
Thank you so
yields
much.
back. I'll now go to Mr. Palmer for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Wagner, your testimony mentions recycling spent fuel, that it could play a role in U.S. competitiveness with Russia and China. It could reduce our reliance on foreign sources for fuel. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, so the ability to recycle material is actually something, for example, that France supplies to different countries, including the UK and Japan. And so it is a feature that some countries are very interested in having available to them. So that's one example of how that would be a competitive advantage.
Yeah, but it also would reduce our reliance on foreign sources for the materials that we need to operate our nuclear fleet.
So that's a second example of where that's an advantage. Depending on the details of how it's recycled and what the subsequent material is used in what kind of reactors, it can reduce our reliance or increase our utilization of the uranium by anywhere from 30% to nearly 90%.
When the Associate Laboratory Director of the Idaho National Laboratory testified, I think it was back in April, I asked him how long we could fuel our nuclear fleet with recycled fuel, and his response that we could provide electricity for all the entire United States for well over 100 years. I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, because it's not only astonishing that we could supply electricity for that long time, but that would substantially reduce the storage requirements for spent fuel.
Correct. So that's Dr. Jess Gian. He's our Associate Laboratory Director for Nuclear Science and Technology. And he went through a series of calculations based on the existing spent nuclear fuel and the amount of energy we're currently using, and came up with the conclusion that we could power at least current energy needs of this country for 100 years, and that's a pretty staggering amount of power. Now, that would require a lot of infrastructure and things to do that, but yes.
I'm going to get to that in just a minute, because there's one other point I want to make on recycling. France has shown that you can recover 96% of the remaining fuel, and I think in our repositories, the fuel rods retain about 90% of their energy capacity. You can recover 96% of that. But there are other things that you could do with the remainder in terms of recycling for isotopes that could be used for a variety of purposes. For instance, in medicine, can you comment on any other beneficial discoveries or uses for products that could be developed?
Yes, there are a number of isotopes that are available if you're already kind of in the process of recycling. In fact, we purchase some of those isotopes from Russia today that come out of those processes that they're executing. And so, yes, there are a number of isotopes that is a desirable way to do it. I would say that I don't believe the economics would drive you to recycling nuclear fuel for those isotopes. But if you had a nuclear fuel recycling infrastructure, then it's really incremental cost to recover those additional isotopes.
That gets me to my favorite part of this, and that is what makes France so interesting, is that the standardization and design for their reactors, and that's what we do with our nuclear submarine fleet, our nuclear aircraft carriers. If we were to go really focused on small modular nuclear reactors, standard design, built in factory, tested in factory, advanced capabilities for recycling, that would be an enormous advantage for us on the energy side, but also in terms of the economics of recycling spent fuel. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that.
Well, that's the direction I think we need to go, Mr. Chairman, and I think there's a lot of bipartisan agreement on this, that we need to take a really aggressive stance on going to small modular reactors. They have zero emissions once they're set up and operational. They'll operate for 60 to 80 years, depending on what we build. It's almost plug and play in terms of our where you can put them. And then the other advantage here that we've just discussed is how we dispose of spent fuel. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I'll now go to Ms. Custer, who is retiring from Congress, I heard, and has been a valuable member of this committee. So thank you for your service. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, for your kind words, and thank you to Ranking Member DeGette for this important hearing. As we heard from the testimony today, the United States must address our long-term nuclear storage challenge, both to safely store spent nuclear fuel from retired and currently operating nuclear generators, and to enable the deployment of next-generation nuclear power plants, as my colleague just mentioned. In New Hampshire, spent nuclear fuel from the Seabrook nuclear power plant sits in dry storage near the facility. Dry storage facilities ensure that no radiation or radioactive materials are released from spent fuel, protecting people and the environment in our beautiful state. While the spent fuel in New Hampshire is being safely and securely stored for the time being, we need a long-term solution for the spent fuel from Seabrook and sites all across the country, as you've discussed today. The safest way to store spent nuclear fuel, as I understand it, is deep geologic repositories, or DGBs. These facilities place spent nuclear fuel in robust, leak-tight containers buried hundreds of feet below the ground in a stable geologic environment. DGBs are built with multiple layers of protection to keep the waste secure. As we've seen in the United States, building DGBs presents many challenges, and the communities where they're located must be properly consulted, as you know, and brought in on long-term storage projects. Consent-based siting for DGBs is a tall task, but we know it can be done. This coming year, Finland plans to open the first DGB at Onkalo. This is for Mr. Stetson or for anyone else that would like to respond. Could you please speak to what lessons the U.S. should learn from Finland's experience building the Onkalo storage facility, if you're familiar with it?
Thank you. As I mentioned earlier, I think Finland's a great example of consent-based siting, how that whole process worked, and how they were able to develop trust within the local community by working with the community to, number one, address their concerns and to listen to them, to really build with them, and really, as much as anything, to be a partner in the whole process so that the citizens there continue and want to be proud and really want to be a host for one of these facilities.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Thanks to the DBG, Finland can confidently build new nuclear facilities with the knowledge that there's a long-term solution for spent nuclear fuel, and that would go a long way toward addressing concerns around our changing climate and carbon pollution. Again, Mr. Stetson or anyone else who would like to respond, can you speak to how this long-term certainty for spent nuclear fuel will help Finland achieve its clean power goals?
Certainly. I think Mr. Barrett wanted to
or Mr. Barrett,
chime in there first.
Well, Finland is a different situation we have. The science and technology in Finland and what we do in the United States is virtually identical. We worked with the Finns for decades and they worked with us. So the technology of it is fairly straightforward and fairly simple. The siting of the facility is where the challenge is for us, and it's easy for them. Very cohesive society, very monolithic, and not a problem, okay? Here, it is much more of a challenge. We were open and transparent and tried to bring in the Nevada situation. Mm-hmm. We were very successful at the local level with Nye County. It would not work with the state of Nevada because they were still vehemently upset about the 87 Amendment, and we could never make that bridge. So if we go forward another repository, I think we could. But we have this trust and confidence that is the federal government going to do what it says it's going to do? Yeah. If we can solve that, we're there, okay? And we can accommodate all the advanced technologies that may be coming forward, which can be great. It will assist, it will help, can reduce the costs, can help us with energy. But we've got to fundamentally address this long-term problem to support the new nuclear energy that we need in this country desperately. And we have to do it.
What's interesting, and you can see it on our committee, but you can certainly see it in Congress as a whole, there is a pretty profound shift among members who previously may have been more anti-nuclear, but given the carbon-free aspect of nuclear energy and some of these technical advancements with the smaller facilities, may be leaning more toward an approach and thinking that if we could solve some of the issues around storage, we will get closer to this clean power goals. So I think we should take advantage of that shift.
Yes, ma'am, we should. There's much better environment today than it was in the past, but we still have to address this issue.
The trust issue, sure. Thank you so much. I appreciate all of you, and thank you to our chair, and I will yield back.
Gentleman lady, it's time's expired, and now go to Mr. Pfluger for 5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and appreciate the witnesses being here. A lot of the questions have been answered. I want to just kind of start more broadly on establishing a couple of facts that, according to not only your testimony but just your experience in this industry. Number one, I mean, how much more nuclear power are we going to need? in this country in the next 10 years? And I'm going to just start down the line and.
Well, I'll cite a couple of things. NEI did a survey of existing nuclear utilities and estimated about another 100 gigawatts by 2050. The Department of Energy has recently published a study suggesting somewhere on the order of 200 gigawatts additional by 2050. For reference, we currently have about between 95 and 100 gigawatts.
Okay, so we're doubling, maybe.
Doubling or tripling.
Maybe tripling. Yeah. Mr. Barrett?
Yes, I fully agree. To meet our international commitments that we've made, yes, it has to.
Okay.
I'm not really qualified to quantify the amount, but I know as we move more towards an electrical system where we're using electrical cars and all of these, we're certainly going to need additional sources of energy.
And as I noted earlier, we are projecting record demand, and not a little bit. We're talking about significant increases in electricity demand in this country. The characteristics of nuclear power being reliable and emissions-free should put it at the top.
Dispatchable power, we talk about on this subcommittee quite a bit. And I'll just go back down the line. Do you think that in order to get to that doubling or tripling and whatever the estimates, it sounds like everybody's in agreement that we're going to need a lot more. Are we going to have a permanent repository in order to then start building that capacity out?
We've talked a lot about community trust and public trust, and I think until you have that kind of a program underway with clear advancements going on, you're going to be having challenges in community trust.
I would concur in that you need both the interim and the long term.
Okay. Mr. Barrett?
Yes, we need a program. We may not have to have an operating repository to start building. We should not wait that long.
Okay.
But we need to have a legitimate program that's going to solve this problem that people can trust.
I concur with that.
Okay. I represent the Permian Basin. The Andrews Interim Storage Facility is part of that. So I've been involved in that, talked with some of you over the last couple of years. In this consent-based model, actually, agree with what Mr. Peters said earlier, that we have to have that consent-based model, especially when it's relating to the movement. And on the flip side of that, we had a facility, and it's very interested in any further comments on, what's it going to take to gain that public trust back? And if Yucca Mountain is not it, then where is it?
Well, and that's a key point. Building any kind of energy infrastructure is a challenge these days. It doesn't matter what that technology is, whether it's just a substation or whatever. You're going to have challenges with that. And as a result, we need to make sure that the law is clear. There was a decision recently, I think it was in the Fifth Circuit Court, that deemed that a consent-based repository, interim storage facility could not move forward. That is contradictory to where this country needs to go, and so it should be examined.
Well, I think two things. Number one, it has to be safe wherever it's stored. And number two, there has to be a short and long-term value proposition for the community that's going to be hosting it. Otherwise, it's of no value really to them to step up and host it.
And I would say a critical part of that is the federal government has to have a credible geological disposal program. The Secretary needs to step out, or somebody needs to step out and do something and engage and find a place, which we don't have.
There's not a lot to add to that. We need a credible, durable program for this, which we don't currently have.
It just strikes me as part of our energy strategy, which I'm not sure that we actually have a national energy security strategy, that we would discuss these things, that we would restore the public trust, that we would come up with these solutions in order to get to that doubling or tripling of capacity. So, Mr. Chairman, I'll give 20 seconds back to the committee. Yield back.
Appreciate the gentleman yielding back. I'll now go to Mr. Sarbanes, 4 or 5 minutes.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all. This is my 18th year here, and among all the topics that I've had the opportunity to get educated on, this has been one of the most challenging, interesting, and one that has evolved substantially over that period of time. So whenever I'm in these hearings on this topic, I'm trying to be as educated as I possibly can. So thanks for the information that you're bringing forward. I'm certainly, like my colleagues, invested in a solution to this challenge of storing the spent nuclear fuel. It's a reality. We're going to have to face it, given the significant role that I think there's an emerging consensus around now that nuclear power is going to play and is playing in our domestic energy production portfolio. And I know that many of my colleagues with reactors in their districts and states are concerned about the safety, obviously the long-term impact of storing nuclear waste at these facilities as we're looking for permanent solutions. Mr. Stetson, in your testimony, I know you shared that you had participated in stakeholder discussions to determine policy priorities that would create a more durable and integrated spent fuel program. Based on that discussion, I know you'll probably be repeating yourself a little bit, and based on your own experiences, what are the kinds of resources that are going to be needed to support the communities surrounding these nuclear reactors that currently act as interim holders of spent nuclear waste? What does that resource picture actually look like in your judgment?
Number one, I think that a safety net revolving around the safe storage of the spent fuel. Also, I think it really needs to have a robust communication system so that the general community really understands what's there and so that they can really have an intelligent understanding of what's going on.
Mm-hmm. So there's not the kind of fear of the unknown. They've got enough information to process.
That's correct. I think it's very important to let the data speak and that you have experts such as the gentleman here putting out the information so that it's something that they can trust and depend on.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think we're all focused on a path forward that reassures communities where the spent nuclear waste is temporarily being held, ensures an effective strategy with community input for selecting the long-term waste storage sites, and guarantees safety in transporting and storing spent nuclear waste for such long-term disposal. Those are sort of kind of framework dimensions of how we move ahead. We know from the history, we've heard a lot about it here today, that finding a long-term site that everyone can agree on is a challenge. Obviously, I think it's commendable that the Biden administration and DOE have advanced these recommendations on a consent-based siting process for spent fuel storage and disposal facilities, which is a process where, as you know, communities can decide after each phase in the process whether they're willing to move on to the next phase. So, Mr. Stetson, again, what assurances can Congress and the Department of Energy provide to support a community that is proposed as a long-term site and encourage it to continue through the consent-based siting process? I mean, it is a process. There is a kind of hand-holding dimension, I guess, to it in some ways as people move from one stage to the next. What's that look like, again, in practical terms from your standpoint?
Well, I think that they have to be assured that the process is going to continue to move forward, that it just doesn't continue to stall and continue with more and more meetings and hearings with really no real progress moving forward. They really need to see something happen. And they also need to see some demonstrated competence in that there's actually something is happening and that the government performs and continues to step up and every time is able to deliver.
Right. Very good points. I think certainty is always welcome in any community on any tough issues, so they can kind of see what it looks like, and trust, which is, I think, the second thing you're basically alluding to, which comes from good information, expertise, and data, and other things that can be brought into the equation. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back per committee rules. Members that waved on will be at the end, so I'll now go to Mr. Cardenas for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It's a very, very important issue, and some people will have come and gone out of Congress, and still we haven't made progress. I'll be leaving soon myself, so I'll be one of those, it sounds like. Today, our nation has 93 operating commercial nuclear reactors. I just asked my staff, how many of those are privately owned and how much of those are owned by the government? Do any of you have an idea?
They're all privately held, and actually with Vogtle Unit 4 coming online, we now have 94.
And all of these privately owned nuclear reactor facilities, they generate income for those privately owned companies?
Yes, there's a number of different utility models, but yes.
Okay. It seems really interesting that we have a...
Yeah,
Go
maybe,
ahead,
maybe
please.
for example, we should question TVA, so maybe
Sure.
I'll yield over here.
Tennessee Valley Authority, go ahead.
Well, TVA is not private, that's government. But I mean, majority of them are private.
Yes, there's 93, the majority are private.
Yeah, the majority of, by far,
But
yes.
private or publicly owned, the nuclear waste is an issue for the country.
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to get that on the record because I'm not sure how often that's pointed out to the public and the taxpayers, because it sounds like we're trying to figure out a public-private partnership at the end of the day as to how to deal with this very volatile byproduct of these nuclear reactors. I got some funny looks. Anybody disagree with that?
No, we have to have a process. And now the private, most of the ownership of the material is private, but there's a contract with the government
Exactly.
to take the waste for its ultimate disposition.
Exactly.
And they've paid, has been pointed out.
When was that contract initiated? When about?
About 1983.
1983. And it seems that that came about because it was becoming an evolving, non-answered solution for the people of the country, right?
This country debated all through, up to 10 years before 1982, is what our path forward. The Nuclear Waste Policy Act of '82 set the path forward that the waste generators, which are mostly private, would pay for the disposal. The federal government, DOE specifically, would have a special organization to use those dedicated funds from the ratepayers to solve the ultimate disposal. So it was a government is responsible to deliver to the nation. And that has broken down politically for the last 14 years.
Yeah. I think at the root of that breakdown is this radioactive byproduct from these reactors lasts about how long? Its potential negative effects if it leaks, if it gets out into our water streams, et cetera.
Thousands of years, but we have the technology to temporarily store it safely and to eventually dispose of it safely. That technology exists. What's broken down is where are we going to do that?
Absolutely. And that's why we have a democracy. I think communities across America said, literally, not in my backyard.
Yes, sir.
I think that's one of the root fundamental issues here. And so what are the cause and effects to, Mr. Barrett, what are the cause and effects, potential cause effects, health-wise, to communities and or individuals that could be exposed should there be an accidental leak, should it not be 100% contained?
The risk to the people who live by any of these facilities, be they the current ones or be they ones in the future, is very, very low. These are all...
No, I'm asking what the byproduct of the cause and effect to the people, if there was an accident, a leak, if it were to get into their water stream, how would it affect the environment that ultimately could it have a negative health effect on the people?
There's no in my opinion, there's no credible situation that could cause that. Now, a meteorite could come out of the sky and blow something up, and yes, there could be, but the consequences of the nuclear biological aspect on the public is minuscule on all of these situations.
Okay, you call it minuscule, but what is the health effect if somebody comes into contact or a community is exposed to this radioactive material?
The biggest, in my opinion, the biggest consequence is going to be a psychological one, as we saw from the accidents at 3 Mile Island or in Fukushima. The true impacts from radiological were very minimal and virtually non-existent. The psychological impact of those things were huge. So the impact of some accident, assuming there was a major accident, would be basically psychological, in my opinion.
It sounds like you're leaning on if a tree fell in the woods and nobody heard it, then it didn't fall. What do you mean that on those incidents there are no verifiable cause and effects to whether it be human species, other species, from those accidents?
the vast evidence of international scientific evaluation of 3 Mile Island and also Fukushima is minimal. Now, 3 Mile Island was really nothing compared to Fukushima, but the biological impacts on the environment and the human lives are undetectable.
My time's expired. I'll give you an opportunity to answer on the record, all of you gentlemen, with some written questions. Thank you.
Gentleman's time's expired. I'll now go to Dr. Schreier for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you to all of our witnesses for being here today. Just 16 miles down the Columbia River from my district is one of the largest and most expensive environmental cleanup projects worldwide, the Hanford site. And this site was critical to our national security during World War II and the Cold War. The Hanford site has now been undergoing cleanup and remediation for over 30 years. Just last month, the low-activity waste facility fired up its second smelter to begin treating the waste via vitrification, which converts nuclear and chemical waste into solid glass for permanent safe storage. This progress is imperative and urgent, as underground tanks first stored in the 1950s and 60s are now leaking, adding to more than 1 million gallons of hazardous waste that Washington Ecology estimates is already in the soil across the Hanford site. Under current standards, the cleanup and remediation is not expected to be completed until at least the 2070s. And delays in funding and cleanup put the Columbia River and the entire region at risk. Mr. Barrett, this question's for you. I'm optimistic about the cleanup moving forward, although I have deep concerns about the decades-long timeline. Congress appropriated historic levels of funding in last year's budget for Hanford, bringing more than $3 billion to DOE's Hanford efforts. DOE, EPA, and the Washington State Department of Ecology are engaged in talks to discuss holistic, realistic solutions moving forward. I know that your experience is more in commercial spent fuel and not weapons-grade nuclear waste, but based on your experience at DOE and with the NRC, what steps can be taken to further improve and hasten waste management in a risk-informed and also urgent way, especially given the threat of already leaking tanks not far from the Columbia River?
Well, I think DOE has a very active program in the Environmental Management Group that is addressing those issues. It's a long path ahead, but much has been accomplished. I think as far as the near-term safety and environmental protection activities being taken are quite good. Eventually, there's going to need to be a place to take the waste when the glass is made. Where's it going to go? That's an important part for the future, but that's some time away.
So just in follow-up for that, that was going to be my next question, is about permanent storage and progress on that, but also, with regard to 2070 as the earliest possible date for completion, is there anything that could speed this up in how you handle different types of waste?
I've been out of the government for 20 years now, so I don't have the details that I can really address that. As to how much more money would accelerate that, probably more money would accelerate it, but Hanford is a very big, expensive place already.
Understandable and true. Thank you. Moving on to you, Dr. Wagner, I was very interested in your testimony about the Idaho National Lab, which has undergone its own cleanup efforts with the Department of Energy for its own defense waste. So if you'd like to comment on any of that, you are welcome to. But I know you're no stranger to delays and long timelines, as your lab has faced the same. And can you tell me any negative impacts from these delayed timelines? And from your lab's partnership with Department of Energy, what steps can environmental management do to avoid setbacks and increased costs and lengthier timelines?
So there's a lot in that. I would say that, first of all, our site is a Department of Energy site, and it's actually a lot of success stories. And I'd like to say, too, it's very different than Hanford. We don't have the scale of the waste that is on the Hanford site by any stretch. But a partnership between the Department of Energy and the state of Idaho has resulted in substantial progress in cleaning up the site, including moving a lot of the transuranic legacy waste to the waste isolation pilot plant, which is a deep geologic repository that we have in the United States today, although it cannot accept spent nuclear fuel. Actually, honestly, I don't think we talk enough about the positive cleanup story that we have at some of our sites.
Thank you, and with 1 second, I yield back.
Generally yields back. Some of the challenges they had at Hanford initially were the concrete lids on the tanks, and then actually building the vitrification facility and the evaporation facilities and all that. So I've been there. It's phenomenal environmental management effort at Hanford. And this committee ought to go to Hanford, ought to go to Savannah Riverside and see some of the environmental management stuff. With that, Mr. Pence, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Duncan, Ranking Member DeGette, for holding this, and thank you to the witnesses here today. I've been encouraged by the bipartisan work of this committee under Chairman Duncan's leadership to modernize our regulatory framework for the next generation nuclear reactors. In the Hoosier State, innovators are leading the way to power the next generation of nuclear energy. Purdue University is a national leader in nuclear engineering programs and home to the country's first and only fully digitalized nuclear reactor used to train students and research cyber-physical protection. Importantly, the university recently released a feasibility study with Duke Energy on how they could bring a small modular reactor to power their campus, which I've actually seen. As part of their study, their collaboration will look into opportunities to safely store spent nuclear fuel on site. Rolls-Royce, with facilities in Indianapolis, is advancing their designs for transportable small modular reactors that provide 470 megawatts of baseload power. While Indiana currently does not have nuclear assets powering our grid, the state legislature has begun paving the way for utilities to deploy advanced nuclear reactors across our state. Dr. Wagner, how have our, in your opening comments, I want to take it a little further, and maybe you've discussed this, but briefly, how have our allied nations such as France, Canada, or South Korea pursued spent nuclear fuel storage, and are there lessons we can learn from their approach?
So each of those countries have a little bit different strategy, and we are closely connected with all of them and have shared technologies and learnings from those processes already.
And there are things that we can learn and
I'd say there's always things that we can learn from each other. For example, the recycling capabilities that France uses are technologies that arguably were piloted here, certainly around the same period of time. And so we do have a good collaborative relationship with a number of those countries.
But we have 50 states, I think you alluded to a little earlier, right? A little different than France. Second question, as you may know, Purdue University is a national leader in nuclear engineering and has done important work to advance research around materials science and manufacturing convergence needed for next-generation reactors like that utilize advanced fuels such as HALEU. Has the nuclear industry begun researching the necessary specifications for storing different types of nuclear fuel?
So the Department of Energy has supported work in looking at different waste forms, both the ones that we have from different DOE-owned test reactors, for example, all the way up through commercial reactors. There's not been as much work on long-term storage and disposal of some of the different types of advanced reactor fuels. Although having said that, they're still very similar to a number of the early test reactors. So there is knowledge on those that will be brought to bear.
Anyone else have a comment on that question? No? Okay, with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Weber, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. White, in your written testimony, you note that every year American taxpayers foot the bill for legal judgment payments for spent nuclear fuel, SNF, storage that accounts to $500 to $800 million per year. Can you expand on these temporary storage sites and the savings to taxpayers that would actually occur with a central depository?
Well, there would be tremendous savings, and I can't give you a dollar figure, but, you know, just the fact that we're currently spending somewhere in the range of $2 million a day to pay the utilities to store waste as a result of the failed program, that in and of itself would result in a tremendous savings.
You may not know the answer to this question, but I've heard talk about there's enough fuel around that we don't process. I think somebody said something about France reprocessing it better than we do, that there's enough fuel around that if we were able to reprocess it, it would last for years and years and years. Can you speak to that?
I'm not necessarily the right person, but I will echo that has come up in this hearing, and the determination was that we could fuel nuclear power plants for at least 100 years.
Somebody else would like to weigh in on that one?
So I can just add to that basically what he's already said, though. Yes, there is a tremendous amount of energy left in the spent nuclear fuel that, if recycled, could be utilized.
Any others?
Yes, there's a tremendous amount of energy, you know, in there, in the fuel. Economically, to recover that relative to everything else is an open question.
That's my next question.
This country should clearly be looking at it. But no matter what the situation may evolve to in the future, there still is going to be radioactive waste that needs permanent disposal somewhere in this country.
And so that you actually brought up my next question. Economically, has anybody done, I mean, they've said that we could use it for, I think you said 100 years, or it was enough for 100 years. Has anybody done a study where we know exactly, or have a range of what that would cost?
Yes, there has been a variety of studies looking at different characteristics with different assumptions to try to envelope what's possible. So yes, there are a number of studies, and I'd be happy afterwards to provide such studies to you.
And what's the time frame for that? If we embarked upon that mission, if you will, would we be able to say that within 1 to 2 years we would be getting it back into the marketplace? If that's the right term, what's the time frame involved?
In
getting that reprocessing fuel and getting it where we can actually use it.
So assuming we had infrastructure to recycle, which we do not, it would still be several years from discharge by the time you go through the process to separate and make new fuel out of spent nuclear fuel. So there would be a pretty significant period of time to establish the recycling infrastructure that would be needed.
Any guess on? Yes, sir.
I could maybe comment. The Japanese have a national policy to follow France, basically, with reprocessing of LWR fuel. They've been working on this thing for decades. They haven't started, production yet, but they're getting close. But they've spent over $25 billion, I believe, and growing, to establish that capability. Uranium price is certainly going up. But, I mean, relatively speaking, unless we have a national security issue, it doesn't make a lot of economic sense. But nonetheless, it's certainly with the new technologies today, which are much better than the technologies from the 70s that we invented, that the French use and the Japanese are trying to use, there are advances there. So it certainly should be on the table and be a matter of a subject of this committee.
Well, I agree with you, except for one statement. You said it doesn't make a lot of sense. I know economically, but our friends, and there's going to be a meeting tonight, Nuclear Energy Institute, I think it is, over at the Capitol Hill Club dinner. And we meet and we talk with a lot of folks about nuclear energy and NRC regulators, former, past or whatever, companies. So it may not make a lot of sense, but I've talked to some of my friends across the aisle and said, why don't you come to one of those dinners? And I was told by one of them, well, I won't go until we've proved that we can produce nuclear energy cleanly and safely. And of course, my remark was, well, I can prove that with 2 words, nuclear submarine. But when we've got people who don't think it can be handled cleanly or safely, that's the reason I would say that maybe we've got to come up with a system to make this happen, because it is available. And I say I'm out of time, so I'll yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back, and I'll go to Dr. Joyce for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair.
There we go.
Thank you, Chairman Duncan and Ranking Member DeGette, for allowing me to waive on to today's hearing, and thanks to our witnesses for appearing here today. We have discussed at length in this committee how we cannot regulate or tax our way to cleaner energy. We have to be able to innovate. Advanced nuclear power is exactly the type of innovation that I'm talking about. By taking the clean, safe, and reliable traits of traditional nuclear generation and shrinking the size, small modular reactors, SMRs, and microreactors can provide energy to a new market of end users. Facilities like mines in western United States or data centers in Pennsylvania and Virginia could have reliable energy without having to strain the grid. Last month, I visited a Westinghouse facility where Westinghouse is using their long history of innovation to make widespread availability of microreactors a reality. Westinghouse has transformed an unused old steel factory into a manufacturing facility for this new technology, bringing family-sustaining jobs back to Pennsylvania. We need to do everything that we can to enable this innovation. If current regulations for nuclear waste are a hindrance to this new technology, we need to be able to have discussions on how we can safely reform them to allow advanced nuclear to thrive in the United States. Dr. Wagner, as I mentioned before, the end users of SMRs and microreactors might not be traditional utilities. They could be a variety of industrial users. What are the challenges with current regulations for this new type of end user?
So you're absolutely right. In fact, in your own state, recent agreement between Talon Energy related to a data center there, taking the power from a power purchase agreement off Susquehanna power plants is an example of the interest in these kinds of things. Dow Chemicals working with X-Energy is another example. In terms of the challenges that I hear from a number of these energy end users who want to utilize nuclear, a lot of them looking at small modular reactors and new nuclear as opposed to existing nuclear. The biggest challenge is, frankly, not one of regulations. It's one of first mover costs and uncertainties in cost and schedule with those reactors coming online when they need them.
And let's clarify some of those costs, Dr. Wagner, and I'm glad you brought that into the conversation. Like data mine centers and mines, these are industrial users, and they're going to be required to sign a contract with the Department of Energy and may have to store nuclear waste on their sites. Are they going to be willing and able to store waste on site? And will this affect ultimately the economic deployment?
So I can't speak to what they're willing or not willing to do, but it adds uncertainty to what their long-term costs and challenges are. And uncertainty is a big challenge in any of these companies' decisions to move forward with.
Do you think that uncertainty will inhibit their interest in pursuing these?
It does inhibit their interest, and it just kind of comes down to how willing are they to move forward in an uncertain space.
Mr. White, Pennsylvania's ratepayers are responsible for $4 billion in contributions to the Nuclear Waste Fund, which is supposed to pay for the permanent disposal of nuclear waste. There have been discussions about increasing consolidated interim storage to reduce taxpayer burdens through the Judgment Fund. You indicated that consolidated interim storage proposals should include a full analysis of cost. Can you please elaborate why? Is this to determine whether interim storage would actually reduce the long-term financial burden on the ratepayers that you represent?
Yes, as a matter of fact, the idea would be to be able to do that kind of economic determination as to whether or not the consolidated interim storage would have cost reduction.
And Mr. White, to your knowledge, has there been a thorough and credible life cycle analysis that would support an interim storage facility?
I'm not sure that there's been a thorough, I think I might quibble with just that, whether it's all-encompassing, because I think there's some aspects that should be considered as well. But there has been some studies done. I'm just not convinced that they're encompassing the entire determination, the entire set of analysis that needs to be considered.
Again, I thank our witnesses for appearing here today. Chairman Duncan, thank you for holding this important hearing, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now go to Ms. Miller Meeks for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman Duncan, and I thank our witnesses for being here. Thank you also for allowing me to wave on to this important committee. The work Chairman Duncan has done on nuclear energy has been truly profound, and a little-known secret, my father in the Air Force actually helped to decommission 2 nuclear facilities in the Army. The Army borrowed them from the Air Force. So the expansion of nuclear energy plays a key role in the future of the United States energy security, especially having a continual base load and dispatchable energy. Last year, nuclear reactors generated nearly 20% of America's electricity. Investments in and expansion of nuclear energy is essential to continuing to reduce our global emissions while also offering, most importantly, affordable, abundant, and reliable energy. However, the Department of Energy and Congress's lack of action to fulfill their contractual obligations to properly manage spent nuclear fuel only serves to act as a barrier to this necessary expansion. Dr. Wagner or Mr. Barrett, are there any technological innovations or advancements that could improve the management of spent nuclear fuel?
Yes, there are some, as Dr. Wagner has explained, that can assist us in reducing the toxicity, reducing some of the volume, but it also have side effects of more low-level waste, intermediate waste, et cetera. But all in all, we have a disposal system that can accommodate, we need to have a disposal system that will accommodate that. But technology advances are going to help us, but they do not overcome the fundamental social, political problems we have.
Yeah, there's a number of technologies that will help, but I will say that we have the technologies today to safely secure, transport, and ultimately dispose of spent nuclear fuel. Future technologies can help us do that better and more cost effectively, but we can do it today.
I would echo that. As a former director of public health, we were in charge of all radioactive material, and most people don't know that there is a transit of nuclear material that goes by on railroads every single day, and we handle that in departments of public health. How can we incentivize the development and implementation of alternative technologies for spent nuclear fuel management? How can we incentivize? What do we need to do in Congress?
I think as part of, as we mend our broken disposal system, we need to look entirely at the entire system in a comprehensive way, as we've been trying to call for. In that evaluation, the newer advances in technology can be folded into that as to how much benefit is there technologically. What are the costs? What are the schedules, as some of you members have asked here today? So it would be appropriate for the Department of Energy to produce such an integrated plan on what are the options and what might the cost be and what might the schedules be. But it would certainly be a very worthwhile thing to do. It's been decades since we looked carefully at what are the cost savings to the nation, let me say, be they ratepayers or taxpayers, for interim storage. There's pros and cons on the interim storage. If we can do disposal fairly soon, it's probably not economic to do. If disposal is going to be generations away, it's economical to do. But how you cite all of these things together, they're integrated. We cannot take a piece out in isolation.
Mr. White, what type of amendment to nuclear waste strategy should Congress immediately move forward with to protect the interests of ratepayers and the American taxpayer?
Focusing the program, I think, is first and foremost. Currently, we do not have a federal disposal program, nuclear waste disposal program. That needs to be started back up. We've talked a little bit about the different models that could be, but at the end of the day, we just need to get something going, and it should be a high priority.
And then, Mr. Barrett, the federal government, to both your points, the federal government spends millions per year on civil damages to electric utilities by not adapting our nuclear waste strategy to be realistic and functional. Should the U.S. move forward with a new strategy that includes Yucca Mountain but allows for additional options?
Yes.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Chilney yields back. I'll now go to Mr. Carter for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you for being here. And I share your passion for nuclear energy. It's extremely important. I'm very proud of my home state of Georgia and what we've done. And We've been the #1 state to do business in for the past 11 years, and one of the primary reasons for that is because we have available, reliable, affordable energy, and that's something we're very proud of. My colleague here on this committee, Mr. Allen, in his district, we have 2 nuclear reactors that have just been, one's in service now, and the other should be coming up very shortly, the first in 30 years that we've had this in our country, and we're very proud of that. And in fact, in my district, Mr. Allen was kind enough to, during redistricting, let me have the oldest nuclear reactor Plant Hatch in Georgia, that's been since it's been providing electricity since 1975 and has been licensed to go into the 2030s. So we're very proud of that as well. All that said, spent fuel has kind of been the stigma that's hung over nuclear energy for many years, and that's unfortunate, and it's very unfortunate that we haven't been able to come up with a better solution than we have. And quite often when people are talking about it, they want to talk about the spent fuel and say that's, what are you going to do about that? And I think that I've always said that the greatest innovators, the greatest scientists are right here in the United States, and I'm confident we can do this. I'm confident we can do a better job in making sure that we are addressing this situation with spent fuel. And so I think it's kind of unfair that we get that. I've been to Plant Vogel, and I've been by the cask, and I'm doing fine. I'm not glowing at all. I don't think. My grandchildren think I glow sometimes, but anyway, that's another story. Let me ask you, and I'll just ask all of you this: how many commercial private spent fuel storage projects are in the process of being developed that you know of here in the United States? We can start with you, Mr. White. Go down the line.
I'm not familiar with how many. There have been several that have been initiated, none successful so far.
Right.
I'm sorry, I don't have any knowledge on that.
We've had about 5 that we've tried, okay, and all of them failed.
Why?
Basically because of host state acceptance.
Because of?
Host state acceptance. We had a licensed one at private fuel storage in Utah. The state said no. We tried to propose one in the 80s in Tennessee. The senator said no. There's one in New Mexico today and Texas that they were licensed, but they were by objections from the state of New Mexico and Texas. They are basically stopped, just like Yucca Mountain is stopped. So
not in my backyard.
We don't. Yes, sir.
Huh? You want to take a shot at it? Anything?
Well, I think we need to, if we had a credible long-term disposal system, it would certainly have assisted in the siting of those interim storage facilities.
Right.
But when the country has no functional system, the host state says, why should I accept this when I'm going to get stuck with it forever?
Well, let me ask you this. How many of the nuclear plants that are in operation now have their own dry cask storage operations up and running?
Everyone except the Harris plant in North Carolina, because it was built to be 4 reactors and they didn't build 4, so they had very large pools. All of the others do, including the shutdown plants.
And you're confident that the casks work and that there's no problems with those?
Yes, sir. Those casks are very robust and well-guarded, well-designed, reviewed by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. I have very high confidence in their safety, but that's not the long-term solution.
Right. Well, let me ask all of you again a question. Why would the Department of Energy want to pursue another interim storage facility given the potential availability of private options and the difficulties in sitting and licensing those facilities and questionable demand for them rather than focusing on a permanent solution? Why wouldn't we want to focus on a permanent solution? Mr. Stetson?
Absolutely. It all comes down to time. The amount of time that it would take to go through all the licensing and processing for a permanent storage goes on for many decades, and you could have an interim storage set up much, much faster in really just a few years. So it's really for the benefit of the local communities that are hosting it, and they really want it out of there.
Anything?
Well, we haven't been very successful with it so far, and until we have an integrated, workable entire national system, I don't think we're going to find a state that's going to accept interim storage that's going to relieve the problems that many of our shutdown sites have.
But that's a shame, because I think we're really missing the boat on this. Mr. Chairman, thank you for allowing me to wave on. This is extremely important, and I appreciate it, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman for being here and yielding back. I think BC Summer has wet pool storage, not dry cast, in South Carolina as well. I think so, yeah.
All of the sites, I believe, except Harris, have dry storage today.
Yeah. Mr. Allen is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Duncan, for letting me wave on to this Energy Subcommittee hearing to discuss the role of the federal government in managing spent nuclear fuel. As Mr. Carter mentioned earlier, my district in Georgia is home to Plant Vogtle, where the first 2 nuclear reactors were built in over 30 years in the United States. Unit 3 came into commercial operation last year. Unit 4 is achieved 100% power and is connected to the grid. This was a significant milestone for nuclear energy and for the United States, and it further underscores by the bipartisan passage of the Atomic Energy Advancement Act in the House earlier this year. As we work to expand nuclear energy capabilities in the United States, it is imperative that we address the management of spent nuclear fuel, which is the subject today. This issue is particularly significant for my district and state, given that both Plant Vogtle and the Savannah River site, located across Savannah River, currently house spent nuclear fuel, and probably over 40% of those working at Savannah River site live in the across the line in my district. Congress previously took action to address spent nuclear fuel by amending the Nuclear Waste Policy Act of 1982 and selecting Yucca Mountain in 1987 as a site for the permanent repository, being that Yucca Mountain is already contaminated and it is the place that I think we've got nuclear fuel stored in 21 locations around this country, spent fuel, and we're in fact, that was the reason for the trust fund to provide this protection at Yucca Mountain. Mr. Barrett, in 1983, President Reagan signed the Nuclear Waste Policy Act into law, and over 20 years ago, the Congress and President Bush certified Yucca Mountain as the site of the repository after years of scientific study that confirmed Yucca was a suitable site. Can you explain why the Department of Energy under 3 administrations has yet to follow the law of this country and license Yucca?
Because the state of Nevada vehemently objects to it, and this is the United States of America, and they have the political ability to stop it because they did not believe that was fair. And I would add a little bit, Yucca Mountain physically itself, that area of the Nevada test site, is not contaminated due to testing from many decades ago.
Okay. What role did congressional appropriations play in this mess?
Congressional appropriations is the tool that the state of Nevada has used to block all progress forward because they do not believe this was fair.
Okay. Mr. White, how much in ratepayer fees to the Nuclear Waste Fund have been expended on Yucca Mountain?
More than $12 billion.
What have ratepayers gotten in return if the Department of Energy continues to not fulfill its responsibilities under the Nuclear Waste Policy Act?
Nothing.
Mr. White, the people of my district, let alone my state of Georgia, should not pay another nickel to the government for high-level waste disposal until the Department of Energy actually accomplishes something. As I understand it, the fee collected from ratepayers was stopped, but Georgia taxpayers continue to pay for the failure of the Department of Energy to take the title to the spent fuel. Should Congress force a public notice of the judgment fund spending so people understand the price of government's failure?
Educating the public on the costs of the program and the costs of inaction would be invaluable.
Going forward, what would you view as a sufficient accomplishment?
Significant progress towards the actual licensing of the repository. We would prefer to see it get licensed so that we could begin construction, but at this point, the fact that there is no review going on at all is troubling. We would like to see review of the license continue and go to completion.
Okay. Dr. Wagner, as mentioned earlier, my district is adjacent to Savannah River site and just across the river. And as you may know, approximately 3,000 spent nuclear fuel bundles are currently stored at SRS. The site is also home to H Canyon facility, which is the only operating production scale nuclear chemical separations facility in the United States. It's been used in the past to recover usable uranium from processed spent nuclear fuel, and is expected in the near future to begin producing HALO fuel, a highly sought-after fuel for advanced nuclear reactors. Are you familiar with H Canyon facility at SRS?
Somewhat, yes.
Can you speak as to how it might serve as a model or an example of a need for a similar expanded capability in the United States in the future?
It actually has been successfully operating for a number of years on a small scale related to DOE-owned materials, and as you noted, producing HALO, similar to what we do at Idaho National Laboratory, but in a different way, different facilities. Those are technology demonstrations that could be built and expanded upon going forward.
Okay, great, good. I'm way past my time. I'm sorry. Thank you all for participating in this important hearing, and thank you for helping us try to solve this problem.
Gentleman yields back, and you're correct about H Canyon as a national asset that needs to remain in place for chemical separation processes. We talked about hot boxes earlier, very similar situation if we're going to deal with the waste. It's been a great hearing. You saw a lot of bipartisan cooperation and agreement on this issue. So we're going to have to decide where we go from here. It's going to take a legislative initiative, and we're going to keep working on that. I want to thank you all for being here and providing your valuable testimony. And members may have additional written questions for you all, so I'll remind members they have 10 business days to submit additional questions for the record, and I ask witnesses to do their best to submit responses within 10 business days upon receipt of those questions. I ask unanimous consent to insert the record. Any documents included on the staff hearing document list without objection to order and without objection. This subcommittee will stand adjourned.
Thank you.
Why they did it. Why they did it.
Thank you very much. Yucca has been decontaminated. I mean, it's been cleaned up.
It never was. Very good.
There was never put any spent fuel
The
there.
weapons testing was in a different area.
Okay.
That's Area 25 versus the other area. So it's 20 miles away, 30 miles away.
Well, I was missing it.
Yeah. The test site, that whole area, consider